Hey everyone, tonight we embark on a journey that spans continents and centuries, yet begins with a single, humble piece of architecture. You're standing on the vast, unforgiving Mongolian steppe, the wind whipping past your ears, tasting of dust and wild herbs. The air is so thin and cold, it burns in your lungs. Look around. The horizon stretches out a seamless circle of ochre grass, meeting an impossibly blue sky. And then you see them, hundreds, maybe thousands, of white rounded domes clustered in a river valley city that shouldn't exist, an urban center built not of stone and mortar, but of felt and wood. This, you realize, is the ultimate mobile home, the ger or yurt, and it is the key not just to surviving this environment, but to conquering the known world. You see a group of figures, bundled against the relentless cold, breaking camp. Their homes are not being packed into boxes. They are being collapsed, turning solid shelter into a stack of components in mere minutes. Imagine the scene. One moment you are sitting inside, safe and warm, sipping fermented mare's milk egg by the central hearth. And the next moment, the ceiling is lifting, the walls are folding like an accordion, and your entire domestic world is loaded onto a massive twow-heeled cart drawn by oxen. This incredible structural efficiency is not just convenience, it's a terrifying military advantage. It's what allowed a few 100,000 people to mobilize millions of square miles, turning logistics into a weapon. You probably wouldn't survive a week out here trying to live in a standard tent, much less administer a vast empire. The sheer brutal reality of the Eurasian steppe demands technology, specifically calibrated for extreme cold, high winds, and absolute self-sufficient mobility. The yurt is that technology. It is perhaps the most important piece of pre-industrial engineering that is largely taken for granted. Most people associate the Mongol Empire with cavalry and arrows, which is true, but without the collapsible city blueprint, without the ability to carry their entire social and domestic infrastructure with them, those cavalry forces would have starved, frozen, or been unable to sustain deep campaign operations. The empire wasn't built on horses alone. It was built on a sophisticated portable housing system that allowed them to stay on the move year after year, never being tied down by the need to return to a fixed base. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're re-watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're walking closer to that cluster of collapsing domes. Now, you hear the rhythmic grunt of the men and women working in practiced unison. The yurt isn't just a dwelling, it's the foundational technology that enabled the entire Mongol lifestyle, which was, by necessity, nomadic. Without it, the vast herds of horses and livestock, the very engines of their economy and warfare, could unmove to fresh pastures. The core logistical challenge the Mongols faced wasn't fighting an enemy, but keeping their millions of animals alive, and that demanded constant, rapid movement across the grasslands, which in turn demanded architecture that could move with them. The mainstream historical fact is that the Mongol Empire, at its peak in 1279 CE, covered 9.3 million square miles, around 24 million square kilometers, the largest contiguous land empire in history. But that measurement is static. The true wonder lies in the fact that this empire was administered from a continually moving capital, the Khan's orju, which was essentially a massive collection of yurts, moving from pasture to pasture. They governed the world from a place that physically existed for only a few months in any given location. Here, as a quirky or fringe tidbit, the quality and decoration of the yurt's felt cover and internal furnishings served as a surprisingly precise indicator of the occupant's social rank and wealth. While the structure itself was democratically simple, a common soldier's ger might be covered in plain gray felt, while a powerful Noyan general or a Khan's relative might have their yurt covered in meticulously stitched white felt, sometimes interwoven with silk and lined with costly Chinese brocades. These lavish coverings were not just for show. They provided a vital extra layer of insulation, literally equating luxury with survival on the steppe. It's a great example of conspicuous consumption in a deeply practical survival-driven society. Historians still argue whether the speed of Mongol conquest was primarily due to their superior cavalry. Tactics, or the unprecedented logistical sustainability offered by their yurt-based, self-contained nomadic infrastructure? Was the horse the weapon, or was the yurt the engine that kept the weapon firing? You look at that collapsible city and realize they are inseparable. The speed of the campaign was directly limited by the speed at which their domestic base could follow, resupply, and establish new, secure camps. Without the 4-hour setup and breakdown time of the yurt, the deep penetration raids that characterized the Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe would have been impossible. The speed you see them moving now, the swiftness of turning home into payload, is what terrified the sedentary world. They weren't just fighting you, they were bringing their entire country to your doorstep and then taking it away just as fast. You step closer, leaving the broader chaos of the camp behind, to focus on a single structure. It stands before you, stripped of its felt skin, a skeletal cage of reddish-brown wood against the pale sky. This is the anatomy of the yurt, or ger Mongolian, for home laid bare. It's remarkably complex for something designed to vanish in an hour, yet its genius lies in the repetition and standardization of its parts. You could think of it as the IKEA of the 13th century, except infinitely more durable and without the confusing instructions. The first thing you notice is the circular wall, the khana. It's not a solid barrier, but an expandable lattice. A crisscross of thin willow laths pinned together at their intersections. This isn't just a fence, it's a dynamic breathing component. You watch a man grab one section of the wall and pull. It expands effortlessly, stretching out to cover several meters, then compresses back into a tight, manageable bundle that a single person could carry. This scalability means you can adjust the size of your home based on how many wall sections you connect to modular systems centuries ahead of its time. Above the walls, radiating inward like the spokes of a giant bicycle wheel, are the roof poles or uni. These are long, slender, and often painted in bright orange or red, symbolizing the sun's rays. They slot into the top of the wall lattice and rise to meet the central crown, the tono. The tono is the masterpiece of the entire assembly, a heavy wooden ring, open to the sky, that serves as the keystone. It holds the tension of the entire roof, locking the poles in place through sheer geometry and gravity. Without nails, without complex joinery, the structure becomes rigid and incredibly strong, capable of withstanding gale-force winds that would shred a modern nylon tent. You run your hand along the smooth, worn wood of a roof pole. It feels light, perhaps pine or birch, flexible enough to bend slightly under load, but strong enough to support the immense weight of the felt layers to come. This balance is critical. If the wood were too rigid, it would snap under the stress of wind or snow. Too flexible, and the roof would sag. The Mongols perfected this material science through generations of trial and error, selecting specific woods for specific components, often trading with forest-dwelling tribes or raiding settled lands to secure the best timber. Here is a standard mainstream historical fact. The classic Mongol yurt design has remained fundamentally unchanged for at least 3,000 years, dating back to the Scythians and Xiongnu. While materials have evolved, modern yurts might use canvas or synthetic insulation, the structural logic of the khana, uni, and tono remains identical. It's a perfect example of, if it isn't broken, don't fix it, applied on a civilizational scale. But there, as a quirky or fringe tidbit you might not know, the number of unipoles and khana wall sections was on just about size. It was about status and numerology. A standard family ger might have 4 wall sections and around 60 roof poles, but the Great Khan's ceremonial yurt could have 12 wall sections and hundreds of roof poles, requiring a tono so massive it had to be transported on a specialized cart, never disassembled. These megayurts were engineering marvels, pushing the limits of the wooden lattice system to create vast interior spaces for holding court. Historians still argue whether the specific standardization of yurt components, essentially creating interchangeable parts, was a deliberate military policy instituted by Genghis Khan to streamline logistics, or if it evolved organically from the practical constraints of nomadic life. Did the Great Khan decree a standard yurt size for his armies to ensure every wagon carried compatible spare parts? The uniformity across the empire suggests a level of centralized planning that rivals modern industrial standards. As you watch the family begin to dress the skeleton, lifting heavy sheets of felt onto the roof poles, you realize the elegance of the connections. There are no metal fasteners here. Everything is tied together with ropes made of horsehair or wool. These ropes, or boshig, are crucial. They provide tension, cinching the wall sections into a tight circle and binding the roof poles to the tono. The entire structure is held together by tension, not compression or rigid joints. This flexibility is what allows the yurt to breathe and flex in the wind rather than breaking. It's a living building, shifting slightly with the elements, groaning and settling like a ship at sea. You stand inside the bare frame for a moment, looking up through the tono at the passing clouds. It feels surprisingly spacious, the circular shape eliminating dark corners and maximizing the usable floor area. The lack of internal support pillars except in the very largest yurts means the space is open and communal. It's a design that forces interaction, where privacy is non-existent and community is everything. You can see why this structure became the heart of their culture. It literally shapes the way they live, eat, and interact. And then there's the door frame, the hallga. Unlike the flexible walls, the door is a rigid, heavy wooden frame, often beautifully carved or painted. It is always, without exception, oriented to the south. This isn't a design choice, it's a cardinal rule. It allows the occupants to use the sun's position in the doorway as a sundial, tracking time throughout the day. It also turns the home into a compass, a fixed point of orientation in a landscape that changes every few weeks. In a world of constant movement, the yurt provides a consistent, reliable center. You move closer to the wall, crouching down to inspect the lattice, the khana. It looks deceptively simple, just slats of wood pinned together, but as you press your hand against it, it yields slightly, then pushes back. This is a marvel of pre-industrial engineering, a masterclass in tension and compression that rivals the principles behind modern suspension bridges or geodesic domes. The secret lies in the geometry. Each intersection of the willow slats is pinned with a knot of rawhide thong, usually camel or ox hide. This rawhide shrinks as it dries, clamping the wood together with incredible force, yet it remains just flexible enough to allow the joint to pivot. This pivoting action is what gives the khana its superpower, the ability to expand for deployment and collapse for transport. But it does something else too. When the wall is expanded into a curve and tied into a circle, the tension transforms the flimsy lattice into a rigid, self-supporting cylinder. The more weight you put on the roof, the heavy felt, the snow, the wind pressure, the more. That downward force is transferred outward into the walls. But because the walls are circular and tied together, they can't buckle outward. The entire structure locks itself into place, becoming stronger under load. You watch a young man adjusting a section of the khana. He pushes it slightly, changing the angle of the diamonds formed by the slats. If he makes the diamonds taller and narrower, the wall gets higher, but the circle gets smaller, useful for winter, when you want less volume to heat. If he stretches it out, so the diamonds are flatter, the wall gets lower, but the floor area expands, perfect for summer ventilation. It's a tunable house. You realize that this isn't just architecture, it's a machine for living. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The stability of the yurt relies entirely on two tension bands, usually made of strong woven wool or horsehair, that encircle the top of the khana walls. These bands, called the bus, act like the metal hoops on a wine barrel. They prevent the roof poles from pushing the walls outward and collapsing the structure. If these ropes snap, the house falls. It's that simple. The entire structural integrity of the home depends on the tensile strength of a few braided ropes. But consider this quirky or fringe tidbit. In some specific Mongol tribes, the knots used to tie the khana sections together were not just functional fasteners but complex, encoded knots similar to the Inca keep. While less elaborate, these knots could allegedly signify family lineage or serve as mnemonic devices for oral histories, effectively making the walls of the home a physical archive of the family's past. You are literally living inside your own history book. Historians still argue whether the mathematical principles inherent in the khana lattice, specifically the understanding of geometric rigidity and triangulation, influenced the design of siege engines and other military technologies. Did the engineers who built the trebuchets that crushed the walls of Baghdad apply the same tension compression logic they used every day to set up their homes? It seems plausible that a society so intimately familiar with the structural properties of wood and tension would apply that knowledge to warfare. You stand back as they lift the roof poles into place. The way the poles slot into the V-shaped notches at the top of the wall lattice is ingenious. The downward pressure of the roof actually locks the wall joints tighter. It's a symbiotic relationship between the roof and the wall. The heavier the roof, the sturdier the wall becomes. This is why yurts can withstand the ferocious gales of the steppe, winds that would strip a modern gable roof right off a house. The wind flows over the aerodynamic dome shape, pressing it down into the earth rather than lifting it up. The materials themselves tell a story of the environment. The wood for the khana is almost always willow. Why? Because willow grows along the riverbanks where the nomads camp in winter. It's fast-growing, flexible, and light. You don't need to cut down an ancient oak forest to build a yurt. You just harvest the saplings that spring up every year. It's sustainable architecture in its purest form, utilizing the renewable resources of the immediate ecosystem. As you watch the structure take its final shape, you notice the incredible redundancy built into the design. If one slat in the lattice breaks, the wall doesn't fail. The load simply redistributes to the surrounding slats. If a roof pole snaps, the tono stays aloft, supported by the dozens of other poles. This resilience is critical. On the steppe, you can't just call a contractor if your roof collapses during a blizzard. The system has to be safe. It has to survive partially broken until you can fix it. You see a child running around the perimeter, trailing a hand along the rough wooden lattice. To them, this complex interplay of physics is just home. But to you, the outsider, it's a revelation. The khana represents a profound understanding of forces, how to channel them, how to balance them, and how to use them to create a sanctuary in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. It's not just a wall, it's a shield against the infinite emptiness of the horizon. The wooden skeleton of the gers now stands complete against the endless grass, a geometric cage waiting for its skin. And this is where the true miracle of Mongol adaptation comes in. You might expect them to cover this frame with animal hides. Leather is tough, windproof, and readily available, right? But leather is heavy, it freezes stiff in winter, and it rots if it doesn't breathe. Instead, the Mongols rely on a material that is essentially techwear for the 13th century. Felt. You walk over to a group of women working near a pile of raw wool. The smell hits you first, a pungent lanolinic scent of wet sheep that clings to the back of your throat. This is the factory floor of the steppe. Felt isn't woven. It doesn't require looms or delicate spinning. It is a chaotic, matted fabric created by forcing wool fibers to lock together under pressure, heat, and moisture. It is the oldest textile known to humanity, predating weaving by centuries, and honestly, it's the super material that allowed this civilization to exist. Watch the process. It's brutal, physical labor. First, the sheep are sheared, thousands of them. The wool is beaten with long sticks to fluff it up and remove the worst of the dirt and burrs. You can see the dust clouds rising, coating the workers' faces in a gray powder. Then, they spread the fluff out on a large mat, layer upon layer, sprinkling it with hot water or whey. Now comes the workout. They roll the wet wool up tightly inside the mat, tie it to the back of a horse, and drag it across the steppe for hours. The rhythmic pounding of the ground acts as a massive industrial press, agitating the fibers until their microscopic scales interlock, fusing into a dense, solid sheet. You probably wouldn't survive a day of felt duty. Your hands would be raw from the alkaline wool grease, your back screaming from the beating sticks, and your lungs coated in sheep dander. But the result is worth it. The women unroll the mat to reveal a pristine, dense white fabric. It's tough as canvas, but warm as a duvet. This white felt is the gers' primary defense. They layer it over the wooden frames, sometimes 2 or 3 layers deep in the dead of winter. The physics of felt are perfect for this climate. Because it's a non-woven mass of fibers, it traps millions of tiny air pockets. This makes it an incredible insulator. Outside, the temperature can drop to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze your breath instantly. Inside the felt cocoon, with a small fire going, it can be a cozy 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius. That's a temperature differential of over 100 degrees, held back by a few inches of pressed sheep hair. ID. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The Mongols were so identified with this material that Chinese chroniclers and other sedentary neighbors referred to them, not as the Mongols, but as the people of the felt walls. It was their defining characteristic. To live in felt was to be a nomad. To live in brick or stone was to be a subject. The transition from felt to stone was often seen as a moral failing, a softening of the spirit. But felt does more than insulate. It breathes. Unlike a modern plastic tarp that would trap moisture and turn the inside of the yurt into a dripping sauna of condensation, felt allows humidity to escape while shedding rain. To make it waterproof, they often treat the outer layer with animal fat or tallow. It smells exactly as appetizing as you imagine. Like a rancid candle butt, it beads water effectively. You reach out and touch a piece of the outer covering. It feels oily, dense, and surprisingly heavy. A single roof section can weigh nearly 100 pounds, requiring 2 people to lift it onto the unipoles using long forked sticks. There's a quirky or fringe tidbit about the spiritual life of felt. Mongols believed that felt made from the wool of a sheep that had been killed by lightning or a wolf held special protective powers. But more commonly, they crafted ongun small idol figures representing ancestors or house spirits out of scraps of felt and fur. These onguns were often smeared with fat or the first spoonful of dinner as a ritual offering. So, the walls of the house weren't just insulation. The scraps of that same material were literally the bodies of their gods, watching over the hearth. Historians still argue whether the immense demand for wool to produce these yurts and the constant need to replace the felt coverings as they wore out was the primary driver of Mongol herd composition, essentially forcing them to keep far more sheep than goats or cattle. Some economic historians suggest that the military-industrial complex of the Mongol Empire wasn't iron and steel, but sheep and grass. The logistical need for housing material might have dictated their migration patterns just as much as the need for food. As the sheets are hoisted up, you notice the stark difference in color. The roof pieces are stark white, often bleached or treated with chalk to reflect the brutal summer sun. The lower wall sections might be darker, made from the coarser wool of older sheep. And then there are the ropes-woven horsehair bands that crisscross the white felt like dark veins. These aren't just to hold the felt down, they help compress the structure against the wind. The aesthetic is striking. A geometric white dome bound by black lines sitting on a sea of green grass. Inside, the acoustic effect of the felt is immediate. The howling wind outside is muted to a dull thrum. Your voice doesn't echo, it's absorbed by the walls. The interior of a yurt is incredibly quiet, a hushed sanctuary, in a culture where you live with your entire family in a single room. This sound-dampening quality is probably the only thing preventing mass homicide. It creates a psychological space of privacy where physical privacy is impossible. You watch as a woman sews a decorative border onto the edge of the door flap. This isn't just decoration, it's structural reinforcement. The edges of felt are its weak point. They can fray and tear. By stitching intricate patterns with camel hair thread, she's essentially hemming the fabric to make it last years longer. The pattern's endless knots, horns, stylized clouds serve a dual purpose, reinforcing the material and invoking luck. It's functional art. The felt covering is the final step in transforming the wooden skeleton into a home. It turns the cage into a womb. It is the barrier between civilization and the wild. As you stand there, watching the final flap being tied down over the door, you realize that this entire empire is wrapped in wool. Their saddles, their boots, their socks, their blankets, and their walls, all of it comes from the sheep. If the horse gave the Mongols their speed, the sheep gave them their endurance. Without this matted, smelly, miraculous fabric, the armies of Genghis Khan would have frozen to death before they ever reached the Great Wall. Now that the walls are dressed in their woolly winter coats, step inside. The air is still cool, but the wind has died down to a whisper. Your eyes are drawn instantly, magnetically, to the center of the ceiling. Floating there, held up by nothing but the tension of the orange roof poles, is the tono. It's a heavy wooden wheel, perhaps 3 or 4 feet across, framing a perfect circle of the bright blue Mongolian sky. If the khana walls are the muscles of the yurt, the tono is its spine and its soul. It looks decorative often, painted with intricate endless knots or Buddhist motifs, but do you let the pretty paint job fool you? This wheel is a beast of structural engineering. It acts as a compression ring. Remember those 60-odd roof poles pushing inward? The tono absorbs all that force, pushing back with equal pressure. It's the same principle as the keystone in a Roman arch, but applied in 360 degrees. It locks the entire roof into a rigid cone that is incredibly hard to crush. You might see a couple of burly men grab the rim of the tono and do a pull-up, or even hang a heavy cauldron of mutton stew from it. The thing doesn't budge. In fact, the more weight you put on the roof, like 3 feet of snow, the tighter the tono grips the poles. It's the kind of engineering that makes modern flat-roofed buildings look pathetic. You probably wouldn't survive a heavy snowfall in a suburban strip mall, but you'd be just fine under this wooden halo. But the tono isn't just about holding the roof up. It's about keeping you alive in a very immediate sense. It is the lung of the house. Directly below it sits the hearth, the fire pit. As the fire burns fueled by dried dung, which we'll get to later, the smoke rises and exits through this hole. Without the tono, the ger would just be a very efficient gas chamber. The aerodynamics are surprisingly sophisticated. The shape of the dome accelerates the wind over the smoke hole, creating a low-pressure zone, the Bernoulli principle, for the physics nerds, that actively sucks the smoke out of the yurt. It's a passive ventilation system that works better than the noisy exhaust fan in your kitchen. Here, a mainstream historical fact. The tono is so culturally vital that it is often the only part of the yurt that is preserved and passed down from father to youngest son. The felt wears out, the lattice walls break or rot, but the tono remains. In many Central Asian cultures, like the Kazakhs, who use a similar structure called a shanarok, the crown wheel is the family crest, the physical embodiment of the household's lineage. To swear by the shanarok is a serious oath. Destroying someone's tono wasn't just vandalism, it was a declaration of war on their ancestry. Of course, having a hole in your roof is great for smoke, but terrible when it rains. That's where the erk comes in. It's a square piece of felt attached to the top of the wheel by long ropes. You can see the ropes dangling down inside the yurt. If it starts to rain, or if the fire dies down at night, and you want to keep the heat in, someone pulls the rope, and the erk flips over the hole like a lid. It's the world's simplest skylight blind. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, in traditional belief, the tono was literally the eye of the house. Looking up at Tengri, the eternal blue sky, there are old shamanic taboos about pointing sharp objects at the tono or throwing trash into the fire that might offend the spirits peering down through it. But weirder still, some oral traditions suggest that in ancient times, the tono served as a birthing aid. A woman in labor might hold on to straps hanging from the sturdy wheel to support herself in a squatting position, literally drawing strength from the heirloom of the family to bring the next generation into it. Talk about pressure on the support beams. Historians still argue whether the design of the tono evolved directly. From the wheels of the carts the Mongols used for transport, the spoken hub construction is suspiciously similar to a wagon wheel. Did an early nomad, perhaps stuck with a broken cart and a rainy campsite, look at his spare wheel and think, hey, I could stick some poles in that? Or did the architectural form evolve independently from the teepee-style smoke flaps of forest tribes? It's a chicken and egg debate, but looking at the wheel above you, the resemblance to a chariot wheel is uncanny. The tono also turns the entire house into a clock. As the sun moves across the sky, a beam of light the sun ray sweeps across the interior of the yurt like a spotlight. It hits the western wall in the morning and the eastern wall in the evening. The Mongols divided their day based on where this light fell. You wouldn't say, meet me at 2 p.m., you'd say, meet me when the sun hits the bed. It integrated their sense of time directly into the physical space they inhabited. You are living inside a giant sundial. Sometimes, in larger yurts, the tono is too heavy to be supported by the roof poles alone. In these cases, you'll see 2 upright posts, or bagana, supporting the wheel from below. These pillars create a sacred threshold in the center of the room. It is strictly forbidden to walk between these posts or to pass objects through them. Why? Because the pillars represent the connection between the earth and the sky. Breaking that line is bad luck, cosmic bad luck, not just spilled salt bad luck. As you stare up at that circle of blue, you realize the genius of it. In a sedentary house, the roof cuts you off from the world. You have ceilings and attics. Here, the most important part of the house is the part that isn't there. The tono keeps the nomads connected to the weather, the light, and the stars, even when they are tucked into bed. It's a window that never closes, a constant reminder that for the Mongol, the only true roof is the sky itself. The wooden wheel is just a frame for the infinite. So, you've seen the parts of the bones, the skin, and the eye. Now, watch the magic trick. Imagine arriving at a campsite at 4 p.m. The sun is dipping low, the temperature is plummeting, and there's nothing around you but trampled grass and yak dung. If you were a European peasant from the same era, building a home would mean months of hauling stones, mixing wattle and daub, and cutting thatch. You'd be sleeping in the mud until next season. But here on the steppe, you are about to witness the world's fastest housing construction project. The cart rolls to a halt. The oxen snort, steam billowing from their nostrils. Before the wheels have even stopped creaking, the family is in motion. This isn't a chaotic scramble. It's a military drill practiced since childhood. Everyone knows their role. There are no blueprints, no foreman shouting instructions, and definitely no pivot. Moments with a couch, it is silent. Fluid efficiency. You stand back to avoid getting trampled. First, they clear the ground. They don't dig a foundation. They just kick away the biggest rocks and maybe lay down some dried sheepskins or thick felt rugs to insulate the floor. That's it. No basement, no crawl space. The earth is the floor. Then comes the door frame. It is placed first, facing south, always south. It stands there alone, a surreal wooden rectangle framing the empty landscape. It looks ridiculous, like a door to nowhere. But then the women drag the bundles of khana lattice off the cart. They grab the ends and walk backward, expanding the walls like giant wooden accordions. In seconds, the door is flanked by the lattices. They tie the walls to the door frame with rawhide thongs, and suddenly you have a circle. This is usually where the division of labor kicks in, and it might surprise you. In the medieval Mongol world, the women were the master engineers. Mainstream historical sources, including the accounts of startled friars like William of Rubrac, confirm that women were primarily responsible for driving the yurt carts, setting up the homes, and taking them down while the men were off hunting or checking the herds or, conquering Russia. The women were the ones literally building the society every single night. You probably wouldn't survive the embarrassment of standing there uselessly while a grandmother hauls a 100-pound roll of felt over her shoulder. Next, the tension band the buses wrapped around the top of the walls. This is critical. It's the hugging force that keeps the roof from pushing the walls over. Once that's tight, the real heavy lifting begins. A strong man, often the only time a man steps in, unless hands are short, stands in the center of the circle holding the heavy tono crown wheel up on a long pole like a waiter balancing a massive tray. The others, women, children, even the elderly, grab the uni roof poles. They slot one end into the tono and the other onto the wall lattice. It happens in a blur. Click, click, click. Within 5 minutes, the orange sunburst of the roof is complete. The man lowers the pole and the structure holds itself up. It's a wow moment every single time. The physics works. Historians still argue whether the specific speed of this setup, which can be done in under 30 minutes by a skilled family, was a result of military necessity, or if the military tactics evolved because of this domestic speed. Did they design the house to be fast so they could invade better, or could they invade better because their house just happened to be fast? It's likely a feedback loop. A slower house would have made the Mongol lightning warfare logistically impossible. Now comes the felt. This is the heavy, awkward part. Using long wooden poles with V-shaped tips, they hoist the massive white sheets onto the roof. It's like dressing a giant in layers. First the roof, then the walls. The outer cover is tied down with ropes that run all the way to the ground, or are tied to heavy stones if the wind is really howling. Here, as a quirky or fringe tidbit, there is a profound taboo involving the threshold of that door frame we set up first. During setup, and indeed, at any time stepping on the wooden threshold instead of over it is considered a grave sin. Some oral traditions suggest that in the time of Genghis Khan, intentionally stomping on a threshold was a capital offense. Why? Because the threshold represents the neck of the house spirit. Stepping on it is choking the soul of the home. So, even in the rush of construction, you'll see people delicately hopping over that bottom beam with the grace of a ballet dancer. Finally, the interior is dressed. The carpets are smoothed out. The wooden chests of clothes are placed along the back wall, the north side, and the hearth is established in the center. The fire is lit, and just like that, in about 45 minutes to an hour, the patch of cold grass has become a warm, illuminated home. Smoke curls from the tono. The smell of tea and boiling mutton replaces the smell of dust. You walk inside, and it feels permanent. It feels solid. It doesn't flap in the wind like a tent. It sits heavy and secure. The contrast with a sedentary home is mind-bending. A brick house is a tomb for the living. It sits in one place, accumulating dust and memories, anchoring you to a specific plot of land. If the river dries up or the game moves on, the brick house becomes a prison. The yurt is a tool of freedom. It is a machine that allows you to occupy the landscape without being owned by it. If you were watching a time-lapse of the steppe, cities of thousands would bloom like mushrooms in the evening rain and vanish like mist in the morning sun. The permanence is in the community, not the architecture. The neighbors are the same, the family is the same, the furniture is the same, the furniture is the same only. The view out the door changes. It's a psychological shift that is hard for modern people to grasp. We equate home with an address. The Mongol equates home with the structure itself. As the sun finally sets and the temperature drops below freezing, you realize the ultimate utility of this setup speed. If they had been delayed by an hour, if the parts didn't fit, if the instructions were confusing, if they needed a specialized tool they lost, they would be freezing in the dark. The simplicity of the design is a survival mechanism. There are no small parts to lose in the grass. There are no screws. There is just wood, rope, and wool, and the muscle memory of 1,000 setups before this one. The family sits down to eat, the firelight dancing on the lattice walls. And you realize they haven't just set up a tent, they have reassembled their world. Now that the yurt is standing and the wind is howling harmlessly against the felt, you need to solve the next immediate problem. You are essentially sitting inside a very well-insulated freezer. The temperature on the Mongolian steppe drops like a stone the moment the sun disappears. We're talking bone-cracking cold, the kind that freezes moisture in your nose hairs instantly. To survive, you need heat, and this is where the logic of the nomad runs headfirst into the reality of the landscape. Look around outside. Do you see any forests? Any convenient stacks of firewood? No, you see grass. Millions of square miles of grass. There is no timber to burn. If you were a European settler, you'd be panicking right now. But the Mongols have a fuel source that is renewable, abundant, and walks right along with them. Welcome to the world of argel. That's the Mongolian word for dried animal dung. You watch the children and women scatter from the campsite with wicker baskets on their backs. They aren't looking for berries. They are hunting for the dried patties left behind by the herds days or weeks ago. You probably wouldn't survive the psychological hurdle of handling poop with your bare hands to cook your dinner. But out here, argel is gold. It's not raw sewage, it's processed grass. When it dries in the arid steppe sun, it becomes hard, odorless, and surprisingly light, like a briquette of fiber. Different poops have different properties. A connoisseur's guide to excrement, if you will. Sheep and goat pellets are small and burn hot, and fast good for boiling tea quickly. Cow and yak dung, the classic patties, burn slower and steadier, perfect for heating the yurt through the night. Horse dung, it smokes too much. You use that only if you're desperate. The knowledge of which dung to pick and which to leave to fresh, and it smells too old and it crumbles, is as vital as knowing how to shoot a bow. Inside the gear, the hearth sits directly in the center, under the tono. In the 13th century, this wasn't a cast-iron stove, it was an open fire pit or a simple iron tripod holding a cauldron. The physics of the yurt works its magic here. The circular walls promote a convection current. The heat rises from the center, hits the dome, spreads out to the walls, and cycles back down. It creates a vortex of warmth that heats the entire volume evenly. A single basket of dried yak dung can keep a family warm all night. It's an efficiency rating that would make modern green building architects weep with jealousy. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The central hearth wasn't just a heater. It was the kitchen, the light source, and the industrial center of the home. Because fuel was precious, cooking methods adapted to it. This is why Mongolian cuisine relies heavily on boiling and steaming, like booze, dumplings, rather than roasting. Roasting requires a big, roaring fire for a long time. Boiling requires a smaller, contained heat source that you can maintain with a steady trickle of dung chips. The architecture and the fuel source literally dictated the menu of the empire. But the fire is more than just utility. It is a living entity. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. The fire spirit, or Gale Galumt, is the youngest son of the sky god. Because of this, the etiquette surrounding the fire is incredibly strict. You never, ever stick a knife into the fire. You don't chop wood or break dung over the fire. You never throw trash or onion skins into the fire. onions are known to produce eye-stinging smoke, which blinds the fire spirit, and you certainly never pour water on it. If the fire dies, the house is dead. If you insult the fire, you insult the ancestors. There are stories of ambassadors being threatened or even executed for disrespecting the Khan's hearth. It's not just a campfire, it's the altar of the home. The smell of burning argil is distinct. It's not distinctively poopy, surprisingly. It's an acrid, herbal, musky scent, like burning autumn leaves mixed with old pipe tobacco. It permeates everything: the clothes, the felt walls, the food. If you met a Mongol warrior in 1250, he would smell of mutton fat and argil smoke. It was the scent of the empire. Historians still argue whether the availability of fuel was the true limiting factor on the size of Mongol gatherings. While the grass could feed thousands of horses, could the land provide enough dried dung to heat the thousands of yurts in a royal encampment for weeks on end? Some theories suggest that the great Khans had to move their massive ordis not just because the horses ate the grass, but because the people literally burned up all the poop in a 10-mile radius. Once the fuel was gone, the city had to move or freeze. It adds a whole new layer to the logistics of conquest. You have to calculate the thermal carrying capacity of the land. As night falls, the fire becomes the only light in the universe. The tono above is a black circle filled with stars. The firelight flickers against the red lattice walls, casting long, dancing shadows. This is the time for oral tradition. The bards, or tulachi, would sit by this fire and sing the epic of Genghis, or the secret history of the Mongols. The yurt becomes a theater. The circular space is perfect for storytelling. Everyone faces the center. Everyone faces each other. There are no corners for secrets. You watch the mother of the family tend the fire. She doesn't dump the fuel in. She places it piece by piece, banking the coals to ensure they last until morning. It's a delicate art. If the fire gets too hot, the updraft can suck sparks out of the smoke hole and land them on the felt roof. A felt roof is flammar retardant, but it's not fireproof. A spark on dry, greasy wool can smolder and catch. Losing a yurt to fire in the middle of winter is a death sentence. So, the vigilance is constant. The warmth in here is different from a radiator. It's a dry, radiant heat that seeps into your bones. You take a sip of hot, salty milk tea, sutai yesai ladled from the cauldron. It tastes of the fire. The whole world has shrunk down to this circle of light, 20 feet across. Outside, the wind is screaming across the void, but in here, protected by the pressed wool and the glowing pile of processed grass, civilization endures. It is a fragile, high-maintenance existence, but it works. And it works because the Mongol respects the scarcity of their world. They turn the waste of their animals into the lifeblood of their home. Now that you're warm and the fire is crackling, take a look around. To an untrained eye, the inside of a yurt might look like a cozy, cluttered room chests, rugs, saddles, and cooking pots scattered about. But you are actually standing inside a compass, a clock, and a cathedral all rolled into one. There is a rigid, invisible grid laid over this floor plan, a cosmic zoning code that dictates exactly where every object and every person must be. You are standing at the door, facing north. Remember, the door is always south. This isn't a suggestion, it's an absolute. This means that no matter where you are, whether in the Gobi Desert or the grassy steppes of Hungary, you always know your orientation. The yurt is a self-contained universe, and the door is the portal to the chaotic, unmapped world outside. To your left, the western side of the yurt is the domain of men. This is where the weapons hang. You see compound bows in their leather cases, quivers full of arrows, saddles, and lassos. It's the exterior department, storing the tools used to interact with the wild world outside. If you were a male guest, this is where you'd be ushered to sit. The closer you sit to the door, the lower your status. The closer you move to the back, the higher your rank. It's a sliding scale of social importance measured in feet. To your right, the eastern side is the domain of women. This is the interior department. Here, near the door, you see the kitchen area, the shelves for bowls, the sacks of flour and millet, the churn for making arag fermented mare's milk, and the equipment for processing wool. This is the engine room of the domestic economy. While the men's side represents protection and hunting, the women's side represents sustenance and creation. And directly in front of you, at the northernmost point opposite the door, is the koimer. This is the sacred heart of the home. It is the place of honor. In the 13th century, you would see a low table here with the family esongans, felt spirit idols, and perhaps a Buddhist shrine or a Nestorian cross, depending on the family's faith. This is where the head of the household sits, looking south towards the door, commanding the space. If you are a visiting dignitary, this is where they put you. If you are a nobody, you don't even look at the coimer too hard. Here, SA mainstream historical fact. This layout was so standardized across the Mongol Empire that a messenger could ride 3,000 miles from Karakoram to the Volga Riverwalk into a stranger's yurt in pitch darkness and instantly know where to reach for a bowl of water and where not to step, so he would untrip over the master of the house. It was a universal interface for domestic life, reducing friction in a society that was constantly mixing and moving. Now, try to move. You instinctively want to walk straight to the fire. Stop. You must move clockwise, always clockwise. This is the direction of the sun in the northern hemisphere. To walk counterclockwise, Widdershins, is to go against the natural order, against time itself. It brings bad luck and suggests you are a sorcerer or a ghost. The daily life inside the yurt is a constant circular procession, a mimicking of the solar cycle. The women move clockwise to serve tea. The men move clockwise to exit. There is a quirky or fringe tidbit about the invisible walls of the yurt. In some traditions, there were specific lines radiating from the fire that certain family members could not cross. A daughter-in-law, for example, might be forbidden from crossing to the nomadsâ side or approaching the coimer until she had produced a male heir. The open floor plan is actually a maze of social taboos that everyone sees but no one speaks of. It's an open concept prison of etiquette. Historians still argue whether this rigid gendered division of space reflected a strict patriarchal oppression or a separate but equal complementary philosophy. Some scholars point out that while the women were confined to the east side, they controlled the food, the money often kept in chests at the foot of the master's bed, and the production of goods. The women's side was effectively the control center of the household economy, while the men's side was just storage for sports gear. The power dynamic might have been far more balanced than the floor plan suggests. The floor itself is layered with meaning. The bare earth near the door is for dogs and slaves. As you move inward, layers of felt rugs appear. At the coimer, there might be expensive Persian carpets or snow leopard pelts. You are literally walking up a gradient of wealth. To sit on the bare ground is an insult. To be offered a cushion is a diplomatic victory. Everything you see has a designated coordinate. The teapot points a certain way. The saddle is stacked just so. It seems obsessive to us, living in our chaotic modern apartments. But remember, these people live in a void. The steppe has no landmarks, no street signs, no boundaries. The world outside is infinite and terrifyingly open. So, inside the yurt, they create hyper-order. They build a microcosm where everything is known, everything is named, and everything is in its place. It is a psychological fortress against the chaos of the wild. As you sit there on the men's side, smelling the mutton fat and listening to the wind, you realize that the yurt isn't just a shelter for the body. It is a map of the Mongol mind. It organizes their society, their religion, and their daily workflow into a circle of felt. But don't get too comfortable in your designated spot, because tomorrow morning, this entire cosmic temple is going to be torn down, folded up, and thrown onto a cart. The order remains, but the location is fleeting. The sun hasn't even breached the horizon yet, just a pale gray bruise in the east, but the camp is already buzzing. You wake up not to an alarm, but to the sound of the world being deconstructed. Yesterday, you watched a city bloom from the grass. This morning, you are going to watch it vanish. This is the dismantling of the engine of war, and it is even faster, louder, and more ruthless than the assembly. The fire in the central hearth has been allowed to die down to cold ash. The warmth is gone, replaced by the biting dawn chill. You grab a final bowl of lukewarm and salty and step outside. The command has been passed down, likely a signal flag or a horn blast from the commander's position, and the reaction is instantaneous across thousands of family units. This isn't a leisurely checkout time at a hotel. This is a mobilization drill. The first thing to go is the skin. The ropes holding the heavy felt coverings are untied, and the tension releases with a groan. You watch the women again, the primary engineers of this operation, using long poles to hook the edges of the roof, felt With a coordinated tug, the white sheets slide off the frame, hitting the ground with a heavy, muffled thump. Suddenly, the gers is a skeleton again. The privacy is gone. You can see your neighbors through the latticed walls, shivering as they pack their own bedding. It's a jarring transition, like the walls of your apartment suddenly turning to glass. The air inside the yurt, formerly a pocket of warm, still, smoky atmosphere, is instantly ripped away by the steppe wind. It's a physical reminder of how fragile their protection really is. Without the felt, there is no inside. Now, the reverse engineering begins. The uni roof poles are popped out of the tono wheel. This is the dangerous part. Remember the tension we talked about in section 3? When you remove the poles, the tono wants to fall, and the walls want to spring back. It requires a delicate dance. One person holds the central crown often on that same supporting pole while others rapidly strip the orange spokes. They bundle them together, tying them tight with horsehair rope. The tono is lowered reverently. It never touches the bare ground. It's placed immediately onto a layer of felt or directly onto the cart. Then the bust tension band is unspooled. The walls, no longer held in a tight circle, relax. The women fold the khana lattice back into their compressed state. The accordion screeches shut. What was a 30-foot wall is now a compact bundle, easily lifted by one person. The doorframe, that solitary portal to the south, is the last thing standing. When it is lifted away, the illusion of place vanishes entirely. Here is a mainstream historical fact. The dismantling process for a standard family yurt could be completed in as little as 30 minutes. In a military context, this speed was weaponized. It meant the Mongol army could graze their animals until the very last possible moment before marching, maximizing the caloric intake for their cavalry while minimizing the dead time of camp logistics. While European armies were still striking bulky canvas pavilions and loading heavy timber, the Mongols were already 10 miles down the road. What's left behind is a perfect circle of matted, yellowed grass, stamped flat by the weight of the sleepers and the heat of the hearth. This footprint is called the bier, and here is your quirky or fringe tidbit. The Mongols believed the bier retained a spiritual imprint of the household. It was considered incredibly bad luck, bordering on accursed, to step directly into the center of a fresh bier left by someone else, specifically where the hearth had been. That ash pile was the grave of a fire spirit. You'll see the nomads steering their horses around these ghost circles, treating the empty patch of grass with the same respect as a physical structure. Historians still argue whether the sheer speed of this dismantling process led to a unique form of scorched earth warfare. Did the ease of packing up encourage the Mongols to abandon territory more readily, luring enemies into traps? Some scholars suggest that because the Mongols had no sunk cost in their architecture, no foundations, no cellars, no fields, they were psychologically immune to the defensive mindset that plagued sedentary armies. They could collapse their city and run away, not out of cowardice, but because home was in the cart, not on the ground. Speaking of carts, the loading process is where the heavy lifting happens. The collapsed yurt components are stacked onto the kibitka, or simpler twa-wheeled ox carts. The hierarchy of packing is strict: heavy wooden chests and the khana on the bottom, roof poles in the middle, and the thick felt pads on top to protect everything from rain and dust. It's a game of Tetris played with wood and wool. The oxen are yoked, standing patiently while the world is strapped to their backs. The noise is deafening. Thousands of oxen bellowing, camels groaning, iron-rimmed wheels grinding against axles, and children shouting. The peaceful solitude of the steppe is shattered by the industrial noise of a moving civilization. And then, chaos resolves into order. The carts align, the riders mount up. The herd stens of thousands of sheep, goats, and horses are pushed to the flanks. You stand there watching the spot where the warm, fire-lit room stood just an hour ago. There is nothing but the bier and a pile of cooling ash. The transition is absolute. The domestic sphere has been dissolved, and the martial sphere has taken over. The family is no longer a household. They are a logistical unit in a tumor of conquest rolling across the horizon. As the column begins to move, the sheer scale of it hits you. It's not a line of soldiers, it's a moving ecosystem. The tale of the army, the families, the yurts, the livestock stretches for miles. The dust cloud they kick up can be seen for days before they arrive. You realize that the yurt didn't just enable them to sleep. Its collapsibility enabled them to become a fluid, unstoppable force. They are a liquid nation. You scramble onto a cart as it lurches forward, the wooden axle screaming a protest. leaving the ghost circle of the beer behind in the silence of the grass. You are now sitting on the wooden bench of a kibitka, and your spine is registering every single pebble on the Eurasian steppe. If the yurt is the masterpiece of Mongol stationary engineering, this cart is its brutal, kinetic cousin. It's not a carriage, it's a heavy-duty flatbed truck made of birch and oak. As the oxen plod forward, the entire structure shudders. There are no springs, no shock absorbers, and definitely no rubber tires. It is wood grinding on wood, a bone-rattling vibration that travels up your legs and settles into your teeth. Look at the wheels. They are massive, often taller than a man, solid discs of wood or heavily spoked giants rimmed with iron. They need to be this big too. Roll over the tufts of tussock grass and the endless badger holes without getting stuck. The axle connecting them is a solid tree trunk hewn into a perfect cylinder. It rotates with the wheels, a design choice that makes the cart incredibly strong but absurdly heavy. You realize quickly that mobility here isn't about speed, it's about torque. It's about the relentless ability to drag a house across a continent, regardless of the terrain. Most of the carts around you are carrying the collapsed bundles of standard gers, the IKEA packs we just dismantled. But look over to your left. You see something that defies physics. It's a massive white palace moving through the grass like a ship on a green ocean. This is the true mobile home of the aristocracy. It's a yurt that doesn't collapse. It is permanently erected on an enormous platform cart, drawn by a team of 20, maybe 30 oxen yoked in parallel lines. This is the high-end kibitka, or gerdagen. The width of this vehicle is staggering. Some reports from the era describe axles over 20 feet long. The driver doesn't sit on the cart. He stands in the middle of the oxen team, wielding a whip long enough to reach the lead animals. The structure on top is fully furnished, with the fire pot bolted to the floor and the carpets nailed down. A noblewoman sits inside, sewing by the window, while her house rolls along at 2 miles per hour. It's the ultimate flex. While the commoners have to build their homes every night, the elite simply park. Here is a mainstream historical fact. The wheelbase of these massive kibitkas was so wide and so standardized that it literally terraformed the trade routes of the Silk Road. The ruts left by these behemoths created a gauge that other travelers had to deal with. In some rocky passes or narrow valleys, the Mongols had to deploy engineering corps to widen the path specifically to accommodate the axle span of the Great Khan's mobile manufacturing base. They didn't just adapt to the terrain, they forced the geography to accommodate their furniture. But there is a sound cutting through the wind that you can't ignore. It's a high-pitched, rhythmic screeching, like 1,000 fingernails on a chalkboard. It's coming from the axles. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. The Mongols intentionally did not grease the axles of their carts. To a foreign ear, the noise is torture. But to the Mongol, it was music. Some sources suggest they believed the screeching frightened away evil spirits and wolves that might stalk the caravan. Others say it was a practical way to keep track of the convoy in the dark or fog. If you could hear the screeching, you weren't lost. Plus, animal fat was food. Smearing it on a piece of wood was considered wasteful, almost sinful. So, the soundtrack of the Mongol conquest wasn't just thundering hooves, it was a deafening mechanical scream. You look at the cargo piled around you on your smaller cart. It's not just the yurt parts, it's the entire material culture of a family. You see the arija chest for bedding, the sacks of dried curd, the felt-trapped idols, and the tools for repairing the cart itself. The kibitka is a lifeboat. If the cart breaks and cannot be fixed, the family is stranded. To be left behind by the kurgan, the circle of moving carts, is a death sentence. There is no AAA out here. This reliance on the vehicle creates a deep cultural reverence for the cartwrights. The man who can fix a cracked axle with a piece of wet rawhide and a prayer is as valuable as the best archer. Historians still argue whether the reliance on these slow, heavy carts ultimately doomed the Mongol expansion into Western Europe and the Middle East. The theory is that as the empire grew richer, the carts got bigger and heavier, carrying more loot and luxury goods, which slowed the army's strategic mobility. Did the loot drag turn the lightning cavalry into a sluggish caravan? Some evidence suggests that in the later campaigns, the need to protect the massive baggage train forced the Mongols to fight defensive battles they were unsuited for. The kibitka made them powerful, but it also made them heavy. As you bump along, you notice the water barrels strapped to the side. They slosh rhythmically. Water is the heaviest thing they carry and the most critical. The route of the carts is entirely dictated by the location of wells and rivers. The straight line of the map is a lie. The actual path is a zigzag connecting water sources. The cart driver isn't navigating by the stars. He's navigating by thirst. The oxen pulling you are impressive beasts. They aren't the docile cows of a dairy farm. These are steppe cattle, shaggy and half-willed, with horns that could impale a horse. They are driven not by reins, but by voice commands and the crack of the whip. The relationship between the driver and the team is intimate. He knows which ox pulls to the left, which one is lazy, which one is prone to stopping. If an ox goes lame, it's unyoked, butchered, and eaten that night. Its hide used to repair the harness. The engine is also the emergency ration. You feel the sun beating down. There is no shade on the cart unless you crawl under the pile of felt. The dust kicked up by the thousands of hooves and wheels coats your teeth with grit. You wrap your scarf around your face, squinting against the glare. It's a grueling, monotonous endurance test. You probably wouldn't survive the boredom, let alone the physical pounding. But for the Mongol family, this is life. The time on the cart is social time. Women shout gossip between wagons. Children jump off to run alongside and jump back on. Men ride up on horses to deliver news or share a skin of arag. The city hasn't stopped functioning just because it's moving. It has just shifted gears. The kibitka is more than a vehicle. It's the foundation of their nomadic legitimacy. To possess a sturdy cart and a team of oxen means you are an independent household. You have the means to move. In a society where freedom is defined by movement, the cart is the ultimate status symbol. It is the physical prowess that allows you to say no to a bad king or a bad drought by simply rolling away. As you sit there, vibrating in harmony with the screeching axle, you realize that you are riding on the device that killed feudalism. The serf is tied to the land. The Mongol is tied only to the cart. Pull back your focus now. Float up from the rattling bench of that ox cart until you are hovering 1,000 feet in the air, looking down at the steppe. From the ground, the Mongol army looks like a chaotic river of men and beasts. But from up here, you see the terrifying mathematical precision of it. You are looking at the logistics of the apocalypse. To understand the scale of what the yurt enabled, you have to do some back-of-the-napkin math that would make a modern supply chain manager have a panic attack. Let's take a single standard tactical unit, the tumen, which consists of 10,000 soldiers. In a European army, 10,000 soldiers might bring a few hundred supply wagons and maybe 1,000 camp followers. But the Mongol army isn't just soldiers, it's a migration of society. Each Mongol warrior travels with a string of remonspare horses. Mainstream historical estimates usually place this at 3 to 5 horses per soldier, though some accounts suggest up to 16 for elite units. Let's be conservative and say 5. That means a single tumen of 10,000 men is actually moving 60,000 horses, including pack animals. But remember, the soldiers didn't travel alone for long campaigns. Their families, the elafun, came with them to manage the herds and the camp. If we estimate 3 family members per soldier, that's another 30,000 people. Each family needs a yurt on a cart and a flock of sheep for food, let's say 50 sheep per family. Do the math. For one single division of 10,000 troops, you are moving 40,000 humans, Liuwan horses, Yiwan yurts carts, 1,500,000 sheep and goats. Now, realize that when Genghis Khan invaded the Khwarezmian Empire, he brought roughly 10 months. You are looking at a moving city of millions of animals and hundreds of thousands of people, requiring a grazing area larger than some modern countries, shifting location every few days. The logistical feat of coordinating this ensuring the vanguard does unto eat all the grass. Before the rear guard arrives is infinitely more impressive than shooting an arrow while riding backward. You see the columns stretching out below you, not as a single line, but as multiple parallel tracks, sometimes spread across 50 miles of width. They have to spread out. If they walked in a single file, the animals at the back would starve, because the animals at the front would have stripped the earth bare. This wide front advance is a direct result of the biological requirements of their transport system. The yurt carts are the heavy anchors in the center, while the light cavalry screens the edges and the herds fill the gaps. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit. The logistics were so tight that the Mongols effectively invented the first MRE meal, ready-tote. It was called borts. Before a campaign, they would take a cow, slaughter it, strip the meat, and dry it until it was hard as stone. Then they would grind it into a fine powder. A soldier could carry the protein equivalent of an entire cow in a single saddlebag. When hungry, he'd mix a spoonful of this meat dust with water in his leather pouch. The movement of the horse would shake it into a reconstituted broth. No fire needed, no cooking time, and lightweight. It was the fuel that kept the engine running when the supply train fell behind. Historians still argue whether a specific climatic anomaly was the secret, silent partner in this logistical miracle. Recent tree-ring data from central Mongolia suggests that the rise of Genghis Khan coincided with a 15-year period of unusually warm, wet weather, pluvial event. This would have caused the steppe grass to grow at supercharged rates, allowing the Mongols to sustain these massive cavalry numbers. Did Genghis Khan conquer the world because he was a genius, or because the weather gave him enough battery power grass to run his war machine? The debate is essentially great man theory versus great weather theory. As you watch the massive formation crawl across the landscape, you realize the yurt is the standardized container unit of this system. Every cart carries roughly the same weight. Every family needs roughly the same setup time. This standardization allowed the commanders to calculate travel times with uncanny accuracy. They knew exactly how long it took 10,000 families to break camp because every family was performing the exact same mechanical ritual we witnessed earlier. There were no variables. The communication required to keep this mass from turning into a traffic jam was complex. You see riders, the arrow messengers, darting back and forth between the separate columns. They aren't just carrying tactical orders, they are carrying grazing management data. Sector A is overgrazed. Move the left flank to Sector B. If they get this wrong, the horses weaken. If the horses weaken, the army halts. If the army halts in a depleted zone, they die. It's a high-stakes game of Tetris played with biology. You probably wouldn't survive the waste management aspect of this logistics train. Millions of animals produce mountains of dung daily. While we established that dried dung is fuel, wet dung is a disease vector. The army had to keep moving not just for food, but to escape their own biological waste shadow. They were permanently running away from their own toilet. The sheer mass of the yurt carts also dictated the geography of conquest. They couldn't cross high, jagged mountain ranges or dense, swampy forests easily. The empire flowed like water, filling the flatlands and the open plateaus, often stopping abruptly where the terrain turned against the wheel. The map of the Mongol Empire is in many ways a map of places where a heavy ox cart can reasonably drive. The visual impact of this moving nation on the people they were about to invade must have been psychological torture. Imagine standing on the walls of a city in Central Asia. You don't just see an army approaching, you see a horizontal Hassan flood of white domes, carts, and animals. It looks like the earth itself is moving. It sends a clear message. We didn't just send an expeditionary force. We brought our homes. We are moving in. It's an empire of total mobilization. In a sedentary state, the loss of the capital city is a checkmate. You capture the castle, you win the war. But here, there is no capital. The capital is wherever the Khan's yurt happens to be parked that day. You can burn the grass, you can poison the wells, but you can't capture the center because the center is on wheels. The logistics are the state. As the sun climbs higher, the dust cloud thickens, obscuring the individual carts. It becomes a singular, breathing organism, a beast made of wood, wool, and muscle, chewing its way across the continent. And at the heart of every single cell of that organism is the collapsible wooden frame that makes it all possible. Drop down from the sky now and land right in the middle of the herd. The first thing you notice isn't the sight of the animals, but the sound. It's a pervasive, rhythmic, crunching noise, like a million pairs of scissors cutting paper all at once. This is the sound of the Mongol Empire refueling. You are standing in the middle of the world's most extensive biological supply chain, and unlike a modern army that runs on diesel and MREs, this army runs on photosynthesis. The grass beneath your boot, sturdy feather grass, wormwood, and wild onions, is the only reason this civilization exists. In the modern world, we think of logistics as trucks driving from point A to point B to deliver supplies. The Mongols inverted this. The supplies, the grass, are fixed to the ground, so the trucks, the horses, and sheep have to drive to them. The entire yurt-based society is essentially a mechanism designed to chase the calorie density of the landscape. You probably wouldn't survive the stress of being a Mongol pasture scout. Imagine the pressure. You are riding 20 miles ahead of the main column, Your job isn't just to spot enemy soldiers, it's to assess the carbohydrate content of the valley ahead. Is the grass lush enough to support 50,000 horses for 2 days? Is there water? If you make a mistake and lead the tumen into a dust bowl or a rocky ravine, you haven't just made a navigational error, you've stalled the engine. The horses will weaken within 48 hours. If the horses weaken, the carts stop. If the carts stop, the food runs out. Game over. Here is a mainstream historical fact. The Mongol pony is a miracle of evolutionary bioengineering. It is short, stocky, and looks a bit like an oversized dog compared to a European thoroughbred. But it has a superpower. It can dig. In winter, these horses can paw through a foot of snow to get to the frozen grass underneath. They don't require grain fodder. European war horses, the massive destriers of the knights, required oats and hay brought to them in wagons. They were high-maintenance divas. The Mongol horse is a self-refueling all-terrain vehicle. This meant the Mongol supply line was infinite, as long as there was grass. But this reliance on grass creates a ticking clock. A herd of this magnitude is like a plague of locusts. They strip the land bare with terrifying speed. This forces the grassland supply chain to be in constant motion. They cannot stop. If they besiege a city for too long, the surrounding countryside becomes a desert of mud and dung. This is why many Mongol sieges involved a rotation system where units would cycle back to distant pastures to fatten their horses while fresh units came in to man the catapults. It wasn't just shift work for the soldiers, it was shift work for the horses' stomachs. Now consider the soldiers' diet. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. For large parts of the campaign, the Mongol army didn't need a food supply train because the soldiers drank their transport. A significant portion of a warrior's caloric intake came from arag fermented mare's milk and rul dried curd, produced by the very mares they were riding, or the ones trailing behind. During desperate forced marches, they would even open a vein in the horse's neck and drink a mouthful of blood for a protein hit, then patch it up. The horse was the vehicle, the refrigerator, and the vending machine. This biological dependency on the steppe ecosystem leads to a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Mongols abruptly withdrew from Hungary in 1242, saving Western Europe from total destruction, not because of political infighting, the death of the great Khan Ogedei, but because of an ecological invisible wall. The Hungarian plain, the Puszta, was the farthest western extension of the Eurasian steppe. It was big, but was it big enough? Some calculations suggest that the pasture lands of Hungary simply could support the biomass of the Mongol army for more than a single season. They had hit the isoline of humidity, the grass ran out, the damp forests of Germany and France didn't offer the right kind of fodder. Did the forests of Europe save it from the Mongols simply by being bad pastures? You watch the herdsmen, often young boys or girls, expertly guiding the flow of animals. They use long poles with loops at the end, the erga, to snag horses without dismounting. It's a rodeo that never ends. The separation of herds is crucial. The horses eat the tops of the grass, the sheep eat the lower stalks, the goats eat the roots and the stubborn weeds. If you send the goats in first, they destroy the pasture for everyone else. So there is a strict grazing hierarchy moving across the land. The environmental impact of this moving city was profound. They weren't just passing through, they were resetting the ecological clock of the region. By grazing the tall, dead grass and fertilizing the soil with tons of manure, they actually stimulated fresh growth for the next season. It was a form of mobile permaculture, provided they didn't stay too long. But if they got stuck, say, by a flooded river, the land would be ruined for decades. You walk past a group of camels, the heavy haulers. They are munching on thorny scrub that the horses won't touch. The diversity of the herd is a hedge against disaster. If a disease strikes the horses, you have the sheep. If the grass dies, you have the camels eating bushes. It's a diversified portfolio of assets on hooves. The connection to the yurt is vital here, because the yurt can be packed in an hour. The cost of moving to the next valley is incredibly low. If they lived in wooden cabins, they would be forced to stay in one spot until the land was destroyed, leading to local ecological collapse, a problem that plagued many sedentary agricultural societies. The collapsibility of the yurt allowed the Mongols to live lightly on the land, despite their massive numbers. They grazed, fertilized, and moved on, leaving the ecosystem to recover in their wake. As the sun sets, the munching sound doesn't stop. The horses graze in the dark. Shift your perspective now. Stop looking at the carts and the goats. Instead, imagine you are standing on the stone ramparts of a fortified city in 13th century Central Asia, maybe Samarkand or Bukhara. You are wearing heavy chainmail, gripping a spear, and looking out at the horizon. You feel safe. You have walls 50 feet high, a moat, and a granary full of wheat. By all the rules of medieval warfare, you are the one in control. The enemy has to come to you, sit outside in the rain, and slowly starve while they try to chip away at your bricks. But you are fighting a ghost. You watch a dust cloud appear in the north. You brace for a siege. But the next morning, the dust cloud is gone. It hasn't retreated. It has moved 50 miles to the west, burning the villages that supply your food. 2 days later, another cloud appears in the east. Then the south. You realize with a sinking horror that you aren't defending a front line. You are an island in a rising sea. The enemy is everywhere because the enemy has no fixed center. This is mobility as strategic superiority, and it is entirely enabled by the yurt. In traditional warfare, an invading army is like a diver on a breathing tube. The tube is the supply line stretching back to their home base. If you cut the tube raid, the supply wagons, the diver drowns, the army starves or retreats. But the Mongol army is a shark. It doesn't have a tube. It carries its ecosystem with it, because the yurt allows the families, the workshops, and the herds to move at the speed of the army. The Mongols didn't have a rear to protect. They could bypass your fortress completely, ignore your strong points, and ravage your hinterlands until you were the ones starving behind your fancy walls. Here is a mainstream historical fact: the Mongol invasion of modern-day Russia and Ukraine. From 1237 to 1240 is the only successful winter invasion of Russia in history. Napoleon failed. Hitler failed. Both were defeated by General Winter. But the Mongols loved winter. Why? Because frozen rivers weren't barriers. They were highways for their horses. And when the temperature dropped to 30 degrees, the French and German armies froze to death in their canvas tents or makeshift shelters. The Mongols simply set up their felt yurts, lit the dung fires, and sat around in t-shirt weather, figuratively speaking, drinking hot tea. The yurt turned the deadliest season into their greatest tactical ally. They attacked when everyone else was hibernating. You probably wouldn't survive the psychological stress of fighting an enemy that refuses to play by the rules of geography. Imagine waiting for the winter respite, the time when armies traditionally go home to harvest and rest, only to see the white domes of the Mongols appearing on the frozen river outside your gate. There is no off-season for a nomad. This mobility created a form of temporal warfare. The Mongols moved faster than the news of their arrival. They would often strike a city before the king and the next province even knew they had crossed the border. This wasn't just fast riding, it was fast living. They didn't have to wait for the baggage train to catch up, because the baggage train was moving at a jog. There is a quirky or fringe tidbit involving the ghost camp tactic. Because the yurts were so modular and standardized, the Mongols could pull off elaborate stage magic. During the campaign against the Hungarian king Bela IV, Mongol commanders allegedly ordered their troops to set up spare yurts and light campfires for non-existent soldiers, sometimes putting straw dummies on spare horses. From a distance, the Mongol camp looked 10 times larger than it was, terrifying the enemy into retreating or freezing in place. Conversely, they could collapse a city of 50,000 people and hide it in a valley overnight, leaving the plain empty to lure an overconfident enemy into an ambush. The architecture itself was a tool of deception. Historians still argue whether this hypermobility was the primary reason the Mongols struggled to hold the Middle East against the Mamluks. The theory goes that while the yurt allowed them to conquer, it prevented them from effectively garrisoning the hot, arid regions of Syria and Palestine. The yurts were designed for the cold steppe, not the scorching desert. The felt trapped heat, turning the homes into ovens, and the humidity of the Mediterranean coast rotted the wool. Did the Mongol Empire reach its natural limit, not because of soldiers, but because their air conditioning broke? Some scholars argue that the Battle of Anjalut wasn't lost by tactics, but by the fact that the Mongol horses and yurts simply couldn't function in the Levanten climate. From your vantage point on the wall, you see the futility of your stone defenses. The Mongols don't need to breach your wall today. They can just ride past you, destroy your economy, and wait. They have their wives, their children, their food, and their warm beds right there in the saddlebags and carts. They are effectively home wherever they stop. You, however, are trapped in a stone box that is rapidly running out of water. This asymmetry is what broke the feudal world. Feudalism is based on land ownership. I own this castle and the fields around it. Nomadism is based on access. I can go anywhere and you can't stop me. When those two systems collided, the static one shattered. The yurt allowed the Mongols to trade space for time. If a battle wasn't going well, they could just leave, not retreat to a base, but simply migrate. How do you defeat an enemy that can pick up their entire country and move it 500 miles to the east because they do unlike the odds? As a defender, you realize that the weapon attacking you isn't the curved sword or the composite bow. It's the wheel and the lattice wall. It's the ability to project domestic stability into a war zone. The Mongols brought stability with them while imposing chaos on you. You watch the last of the dust settle. The horizon is empty again. But you know they are out there, just over the hill, comfortable and fed, waiting for you to open the gate. The silence of the empty steppe is more terrifying than the drums of war. You are fighting a force of nature, a hurricane that builds its own shelter. And as the sun sets on your stone walls, you realize that your permanence is your tomb, and their transience is their immortality. So, we've established that the Mongols are a mobile military machine, a logistical miracle, and an ecological force of nature. But 1 million armed people riding horses around the continent isn't a civilization. Without rules, it's just a very large, very dangerous mob. How do you police a city that changes shape every night? How do you enforce contracts, settle divorces, or punish murderers when you don't have a courthouse, a jail, or even a filing cabinet? Welcome to the jurisdiction of the Great Yasa. Imagine you are a Mongol commoner. You've just set up your yurt for the evening. You're tired, you smell like ox sweat, and you see your neighbor sneaking over to your cart to steal a leather bridle. In a sedentary city, you'd call the town guard. They'd throw the guy in a dungeon, and he'd rot there until a magistrate got around to him. But here, there are no dungeons. You can put a prisoner in a cell because the cell has to fit on a cart, and why waste a perfectly good cart on a criminal? The Mongol solution to crime is brutal, immediate, and entirely shaped by their architecture. There is no incarceration, only restitution or elimination. The Yasa or Iksasag is the code of laws decreed by Genghis Khan. It isn't just a list of don'ts. It is the operating system for the yurt-based society. Because the society is mobile, the law has to be portable. It lives in the minds of the people and the terrifying authority of the Jarguchis, the judges. You watch a Jarguchi hold court. He doesn't sit on a high bench in a stone hall. He sits on a white felt rug in front of his yurt, the open sky, his ceiling. The accused stands before him. There is no paperwork, no bureaucratic delay. The trial is public, oral, and fast. The transparency is absolute. Everyone in the camp can hear the verdict, and this public nature acts as a powerful deterrent. When the walls of your home are made of felt, there are no private crimes. Here is a mainstream historical fact. The Yasa was extremely strict about community cohesion. One of its core tenets was the mandatory duty of hospitality. If a traveler stopped at your yurtevin, if he was a stranger, you were legally required to feed him and give him a place to sleep. Refusing a guest wasn't just rude, it was a crime. In a landscape as lethal as the steppe, closing your door was tantamount to murder. The law codified the survival strategy of the herd. We survive together, or we die alone. But the laws could also be bafflingly specific to the environment. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. Under the Yasa, it was a capital offense punishable by death to urinate into running water or to wash your clothes in a river during a thunderstorm. This sounds like superstitious madness, and partly it was rooted in the fear of angering the water spirits or luwus. But think about the logic. In a dry environment where thousands of people and animals drink from the same stream, polluting the water source is an act of bioterrorism, and washing clothes during a storm. That's asking to be struck by lightning, which the Mongols feared above all else. The law wasn't just about justice, it was about spiritual and hygienic hygiene. Historians still argue whether the Yasa was ever actually a written constitution in the modern sense. Was there a master scroll kept in the Khan's treasury? Or was it simply a collection of Genghis' sayings and ad hoc rulings that were memorized by the royal family? Some scholars believe the secret code was so secret that it didn't exist as a physical text, allowing the khans to alter it as needed. It was a living document in the most literal sense. It lived in the memory of the judges. The enforcement of the â solved the prison problem with terrifying simplicity. For minor crimes, petty theft, disrespect, the punishment was usually fine spade and livestock or physical beatings. For major crimes, treason, cattle, rustling, adultery, sorcery, the punishment was death. But not just any death. The Mongols had a strict taboo against spilling noble blood on the ground. If a rival prince or high-ranking official broke the law, he wasn't beheaded. He was rolled up in a carpet and trampled by horses, or had his back broken. It was a way to kill the body while respecting the soul's container. You stand there as the jarguchi delivers a verdict. The sentence is carried out immediately. There is no appeal process. The efficiency of the â meant that the Mongol Empire, despite its size, was incredibly safe for travelers. It was said that a virgin carrying a sack of gold could walk from one end of the empire to the other without being molested. Why? Because everyone knew that if they stole the gold, the Khan's justice would find them, even if they rode 1,000 miles away. You can run from a city watchman. You can't run from a law that travels faster than you do. The â also standardized the administrative aspects of the mobile state. It dictated how the hunt was conducted, a massive coordinated military exercise disguised as a deer hunt. It set the rules for the postal system, the yam. It even exempted religious leaders, doctors, and undertakers from taxes. Yes, the Mongols invented tax-exempt status for non-profits. But the most profound aspect of the â was how it unified the disparate tribes. Before Genghis, a Tatar might kill a Merkit just for being a Merkit. The â replaced tribal loyalty with loyalty to the state. It created a meritocracy where a shepherd could become a general if he followed the law and showed competence. The law was the glue that held the felt walls together. As you walk back to your yurt, navigating the perfectly ordered rows of carts, you realize that the â is the software running on the hardware of the yurt. The strict spatial arrangement inside the home section 8 trained the Mongols in obedience and hierarchy from birth. The â simply extended that domestic discipline to the empire at large. The Great Khan was just the father of the ultimate massive household. And just like the yurt, the law was designed to be universal. It applied to the shaman, the Christian, the Muslim, and the Buddhist equally. It didn't care what god you prayed to, as long as you paid your taxes and didn't wash your socks in the river. It was a ruthless, secular pragmatism that allowed the empire to absorb cultures without breaking them, at least, not initially. In the silence of the night, you might hear the distant scream of a violator receiving the lash, or the silence of a man who has been banished to the wilderness, a fate often worse than death. In a world where life depends on the group, being cast out to have your yurt taken and your fire extinguished is the ultimate erasure. The â reminds you, you are part of the circle or you are nothing. Walk with me through the camp at dawn again. The â we just talked about provides the iron skeleton of order: don't steal, don't kill, don't wash your socks in the creek. But as the sun hits the felt domes, you hear something that sounds impossible for the 13th century. To your left, from a large yurt topped with a wooden cross, you hear the chanting of Nestorian Christian priests singing hymns in Syriac. 100 yards to your right, a muezzin stands on a cart, calling the faithful to prayer in Arabic. Further down, the deep-throating drone of Buddhist monks vibrates through the air, and weaving through it all is the frantic drumming of a shaman, dancing around a fire to commune with the spirits of the earth. In Europe at this exact moment, people are burning each other at the stake over slight disagreements in scripture. In the Middle East, the Crusades are grinding on, but here, in the heart of the most brutal military machine in history, you are standing in the most religiously tolerant place on earth. This is the Pax Mongolica, and it flourished under the felt roof. You probably wouldn't survive the cognitive dissonance of being a medieval missionary here. You'd arrive expecting to find godless heathens, only to be invited into a yurt where Jesus sits on the altar next to a statue of the Buddha and a felt doll of a wolf spirit. The Mongol attitude towards religion wasn't convert or die. It was pray for us, and we don't care how you do it. This tolerance wasn't born out of some high-minded Enlightenment philosophy. It was born from the yurt itself. When you live in a single-room circular house, you learn quickly that fighting over metaphysics is a waste of space. But more importantly, it was rooted in the Mongol spiritual worldview, Tengrism. The Mongols believed in the eternal blue sky Tengri. The sky covers everyone. It doesn't have borders. So why would the god of the sky care if you call him Allah, Jehovah, or Buddha? To the Khan, all religions were just different dialects of the same spiritual language. Here is a mainstream historical fact. In 1254, the great Khan Mungai staged a massive theological debate in the capital, Karakoram. He invited Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists to sit down and argue which religion was best. It was like a medieval pay-per-view event. The judges were 3 men, 1 Christian, 1 Muslim, and 1 Buddhist. The debate went on for rounds, with each side using logic to dismantle the other's arguments. And how did it end? Did the Khan convert? No. According to the Franciscan friar William of Rubrek, who was there, the debate ended because everyone got too drunk to continue. The Khan essentially said, "You all have good points, now let's drink." It was the ultimate dismissal of religious dogma in favor of pragmatic partying. But this tolerance had a strategic edge. The Mongols realized early on that religion is a powerful tool for controlling populations. By exempting priests, imams, and monks from taxes as part of the yasa, they effectively bought the loyalty of the local influencers. If the priest tells the village that the Khan is God's punishment or God's chosen instrument, the village doesn't rebel. It was a masterclass in soft power. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, the Khans treated religion like an insurance policy. They were hedge fund managers of the soul. Before a major battle, a Mongol general wouldn't just ask the shaman for a blessing. He would ask the Christians to hold a mass, the Muslims to read the Quran, and the Buddhists to spin their prayer wheels. They literally stacked the spiritual deck. The logic was simple. We don't know for sure which god is the strongest, so we're going to ping all of them just in case. It's the theological equivalent of buying a lottery ticket for every number. Historians still argue whether this tolerance was genuine respect or simply supreme indifference. Did the Mongols tolerate other faiths because they valued them? Or because they considered them all equally inferior to their own direct connection with Tengri? Some scholars argue that the Mongols viewed sedentary religions as technologies to be exploited, like siege engines or watermills. You use the Muslim engineers to smash walls, and you use the Taoist monks to try to find an elixir of immortality. It wasn't multiculturalism. It was resource extraction applied to divinity. Inside the average ger, this played out in the Koimurtha sacred back section we visited earlier. In a mixed marriage household, which was common, Genghis Khan's mother was a Christian. As were many royal wives, the altar would be a syncretic mess. You might see a cross made of felt, a silver cup for arag offerings, and a bundle of arrows representing the ancestor spirits. The architecture of the yurt, with its single central focus, the fire, and its single view, the sky through the tono, naturally pulled these disparate elements together. There are no separate rooms for separate gods. This openness also meant that the yurt became a vehicle for the transmission of ideas. When a Franciscan friar sat in a yurt drinking tea with a Tibetan lama, they exchanged information about geography, medicine, and astronomy that had never crossed borders before. The ger was the original chat room. It was a mobile salon where East met West, usually over a bowl of mutton soup. But don't mistake tolerance for weakness. If a religion challenged the political authority of the Khan, the hammer came down. The Ismaili assassins in Persia, or the Taoist sects in China that got too political, were wiped out with the same ruthless efficiency as any enemy army. The deal was clear. You can believe whatever you want inside your head or your temple. But the moment your god tells you to disobey the Khan, your god is fired and you are dead. You stand outside a large church yuta, standard lattice structure, but covered in white felt with red crosses stitched onto it. It's on wheels, it moves with the army. This is the ultimate symbol of their approach. Even God has to be mobile. The altar is bolted to the floorboards of the cart. The incense burner swings to the rhythm of the oxen. The Mongols didn't just conquer people, they mobilized their gods. They put the cathedral on wheels and dragged it to the next battlefield. As the sun climbs higher, the cacophony of prayers merges into the general noise of the camp, the bleating sheep, the shouting children, the screeching axles. It all blends together. To the Mongol, it's all just noise under the eternal blue sky. The open door of the yurt, facing south to welcome the sun, welcomes the Christian monk and the Muslim merchant equally. In a world of stone walls and closed minds, the felt walls proved to be the only ones capable of holding the entire world inside. Now, imagine you are a Russian prince or a Persian emissary. You have traveled weeks to submit to the Great Khan. You expect to find a savage warlord living in a dirty tent. You crest a hill, and your jaw hits the floor. You aren't looking at a campsite. You are looking at a moving city of white felt that stretches as far as the eye can see. And in the center of it, dominating the skyline like a white mountain, is the orju. This isn't a yurt, it's a cathedral of wool. The standard ger we've been talking about is maybe 15 to 20 feet across cozy practical. The Khan's ceremonial tent is a monstrosity of engineering that defies the logic of the steppe. Medieval travelers like Friar William of Rubrac described these royal tents as being so massive that they could hold hundreds of people. The interior width might be 30 or 40 feet, with a ceiling soaring high enough to accommodate a raised throne and distinct levels of seating. But the most mind-bending part isn't the size. It's the fact that this thing moves without being taken apart. You see, for the Khan, the act of collapsing his home would be a sign of instability. The ruler must be constant. So, the Mongol engineers built a vehicle that makes a modern monster truck look like a toy. This is the Great Cart. You watch it rumbling towards you, the ground shaking with every rotation of its wheels. It is drawn by a team of not 2, not 4, but 22 oxen. The oxen are yoked in 2 rows of 11, pulling with unified, straining muscle. The driver doesn't sit on the cart. He stands in the doorway of the moving palace, looking down at you like a captain on the bridge of a ship. The axle of this cart is as thick as a ship's mast. A single colossal timber hewn from a pine tree brought from the forests of Siberia. The wheels are taller than a man, spaced 20 feet apart. The structure on top, the orju itself, is permanently bolted to the chassis. It is a mobile fortress of luxury. Here is a mainstream historical fact. The English word horde, as in the Golden Horde, comes directly from the Turkic Mongol word orju or orda, which means camp or headquarters. But in the West, we associate horde with a chaotic swarm of people. In reality, the orju was the center of strict administration. It was the White House, the Pentagon, and the Supreme Court all rolled into one. And it happened to be parking in a different valley every week. The Golden Horde wasn't named for the color of their skin or their loot. It was likely named for the golden brocade that covered the Khan's royal tent, shimmering in the sun like a beacon of power. Step inside this rolling palace, the simple, smoky atmosphere of the commoner's ger is gone. The walls here are lined with ermine and sable furs. The wooden lattice is covered in gold leaf. The floor isn't trampled earth. It's layered with Persian carpets so thick your boots sink into them. In the center, instead of a simple fire pit, there might be a brazier of intricate silverwork, burning perfumed wood imported from India. The air smells of wealth incense, roasted meats, and fermented milk. At the koimer, the place of honor, the Khan sits on a raised dais, often sharing the space with his primary wife, the Khatan. This elevation is crucial. In a flat world, height is power. By sitting 3 feet above everyone else, the Khan replicates the hierarchy of the sky over the earth. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, these massive mobile palaces were sometimes referred to as moving hills or swans by observers because of the white felt. But the construction was so valuable that when the cart axle inevitably snapped, a common occurrence, given the insane weight, the Khan wouldn't just abandon the vehicle. The army would stop, and thousands of men would be ordered to physically lift the entire palace fully furnished, while the engineers swapped out the axle underneath. Imagine the scene, an entire regiment of the world's deadliest warriors playing pit crew for a giant house. Historians still argue whether the sheer size of the orju tents described by travelers were exaggerations or literal measurements. How could a wooden axle support a structure weighing potentially 10 tons over rough terrain without snapping every mile? Some engineers suggest the Mongols must have used a boogie system or multiple axles to distribute the weight, though the historical illustrations usually show a single impossible axle. Was it superior wood technology or just medieval poetic license? The orju also served a critical function in power projection. When the Mongols conquered a city, they didn't move into the local palace. They pitched the orju outside the walls. Why? Because moving into the city would make them look like they were adopting the conquered culture. By forcing the local kings to come out to the tent, the Khan maintained his dominance. "I don't come to your house, you come to my camp." It was a deliberate architectural snub. Inside the orju, the layout we saw in the small gers is scaled up to imperial proportions. The men's side becomes a waiting room for generals and warlords. The women's side becomes a complex court for the cottons and their ladies-in-waiting. The space is filled with the loot of the world: Venetian glass, Chinese porcelain, Russian furs. It is a museum of conquest on wheels. You notice the guards at the door. They aren't just bouncers. They are the kaisig, the imperial guard. To cross the threshold of the orju without permission or to step on that sacred threshold is instant death. The entrance is a spiritual airlock. Inside is the center of the world. Outside is just territory. As you watch the orju settle into its new location, flanked by thousands of smaller yurts arranged in precise concentric circles, you realize the terrifying message it sends. A stone castle says, "I am strong here." The orju says, "I am strong everywhere." It turns the entire continent into the Khan's backyard. There is no away for this government. It is always coming to you. If Genghis Khan was the austere CEO of a lean, mean startup, his son and successor Ogedei Khan is the trust fund baby who took the company public and threw the biggest launch party in human history. And the wildest part, the party never stopped moving. You are now walking through the orju of the 1230s. The vibe has shifted completely. Under Genghis, everything was functional. Every arrow, every horse, every calorie had a purpose. But here, under Ogedei, the camp smells less like dung and sweat and more like perfume and stale wine. You are witnessing the transition of the Mongol Empire from a conquering army into a mobile state of unimaginable excess. The logistics we talked about earlier, the tight management of grass and water, are now being strained to the breaking point by a new kind of cargo: booze. You watch a convoy of heavy carts rolling in from the south. They aren't carrying yurts or weapons. They are carrying massive ceramic jars of grape wine from Persia, rice wine from China, and mead from the forests of the north. Ogedei is a man who loves to drink, and the entire empire has warped to accommodate his thirst. You probably wouldn't survive a night drinking with the Great Khan. We aren't talking about a glass of Merlot with dinner. We are talking about competitive binge drinking rituals that last until dawn, conducted in a tent the size of a gymnasium. Here is a mainstream historical fact. Ogedei was known for his legendary generosity, often to a fault. He treated the imperial treasury like a bottomless vending machine. If a merchant arrived with a caravan of goods, Ogedei wouldn't haggle. He would often pay double the asking price just to show he could. He would stand in front of his royal yurt and literally toss ingots of silver to the poor. It was fiscal insanity, but it bought loyalty. The movable feast wasn't just a metaphor. It was an economic stimulus package on wheels. But imagine the headache of moving a treasury that keeps getting heavier. Under Genghis, loot was distributed quickly. Under Ogedei, the taxation system of the conquered world funneled gold back to the Khan's camp. You see carts groaning under the weight of silver bars, silk bolts, and pearls. The security required for this mobile bank vault is intense. The kaisig guard has evolved from bodyguards into armored bank tellers with swords. This era gives us a quirky or fringe tidbit. Ogedei eventually built a fixed capital at Karakoram, which we'll get to, but he hated living there. He felt claustrophobic within walls. So he essentially turned the city into a warehouse for his stuff, while he continued to live in his massive yurt outside the gates. He would travel in a seasonal loop, checking in on his permanent capital only when necessary. It's like building a mansion and then sleeping in the RV parked in the driveway because the mansion feels too stuffy. The logistical burden of this luxury is terrifying. The orju is no longer just feeding soldiers. It's feeding thousands of Hangerson diplomats, scribes, and cooks. The menu has changed from dried meat powder boards to elaborate feasts, featuring ingredients from 4 corners of the continent. You might see a chef preparing a sheep carcass stuffed with a duck, which is stuffed with a chicken, seasoned with Indian spices. The food miles on Ogedei's dinner table are astronomical. Historians still argue whether Ogedei's alcoholism was a personal failing or a cultural side effect of the rapid expansion. The Mongols went from drinking low-alcohol fermented milk, around 23% ABV, to drinking distilled spirits and strong wines, 1,040% ABV, almost overnight. Their biology and cultural drinking rituals, which encouraged finishing the bowl, weren't adapted to the hard stuff. Some scholars argue that the Great Khan's hangover was the single biggest threat to the empire's stability, cutting short the lives of Ogedei and his son Gujuk and saving Europe from further invasion simply because the leadership kept drinking themselves to death. While the famous silver tree fountain which dispensed 4 different types of alcoholic drinks automatically was built in the stone city of Karakoram, the concept of the magical flowing bar traveled with Ogedei. His personal yurt was a carnival of delights. You see acrobats from China, wrestlers from the steppe, and musicians from Baghdad performing in the center ring. The yurt has become a portable Las Vegas. But look at the strain on the animals. The oxen are pulling carts filled with ice harvested from frozen rivers to keep the khana's drinks cold in the summer. They are pulling carts filled with heavy brocade tents that serve no military purpose other than to look impressive. The efficiency of the war machine is being bogged down by the baggage of empire. The tooth-to-tail ratio soldiers to support staff is getting worse. Yet, this mobile court is also the first true global government. You see scribes sitting in designated office yurts, writing decrees in Uyghur, Persian, and Chinese. They are stamping documents with the Great Seal of the Khan, while the cart they are sitting in bumps over a badger hole. The bureaucracy is mobile. A tax policy decided in a yurt in Mongolia is enforced in a market in Kiev 3 months later. It is administrative globalization, powered by the wheel and the brush. As you watch Ogedei stumble out of his palace tent at noon, holding a goblet, surrounded by sycophants, you realize the paradox. The yurt made them strong because it was simple, light, and tough. Now, they are trying to make the yurt complex, heavy, and soft. They are trying to live like emperors of a stone city while still pretending to be nomads of the grass. The architecture is stretching to accommodate a lifestyle it wasn't designed for. The wheels are screeching a little louder now, not just from the lack of grease, but from the sheer weight of the gold stacked on the floorboards. Fast forward a few decades, the dust of the conquest has settled, and we are now in the era of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis. We are standing in the heart of what is today Beijing, but in the 13th century, this is a giant construction site called Dadu, or Great Capital. If Ogedei was the guy living in an RV in the driveway of a mansion, Kublai is the guy who decides to bulldoze the mansion and build a weird, high-concept architectural fusion that makes everyone uncomfortable. He realizes he couldn't live in a tent forever if he wants to be the emperor of China. But he refuses to live in a claustrophobic Chinese maze. So, what does he do? He tries to imprint the DNA of the yurt onto the skeleton of a metropolis. You are walking down the central axis of this new city. It is massive. The streets are broad and straight wide enough for 9 horsemen to ride abreast. This is a callback to the open steppe. Traditional Chinese cities were often cramped, winding affairs designed for defense and pedestrian traffic. Kublai's city is designed for flow. It's designed for the kibitka carts we rode in Section 10. He literally zoned the capital of China to be compatible with his grandmother's station wagon. But look closer at the geometry. The city is a square. Yes, that's traditional Chinese feng shui. But inside the square, the heart of the city beats with a nomadic rhythm. You stop at the Tuancheng or the Round City. It's a fortress, but look at the shape. It isn't a square keep or a rectangular barrack. It is a massive, circular platform surrounded by a circular wall. It stands there like a petrified yurt. Here is a mainstream historical fact. The layout of Dodowich forms the foundational footprint of modern Beijing was centered around a massive artificial lake, the Tai Lake. On an island in this lake, Kublai built his private retreat. Why an island? Because it mimicked the isolation and security of the Orju in the middle of the grassy sea. He created a water steppe. Inside this island retreat, the buildings were arranged not in the rigid grid of a Confucian court, but in a freer, more organic cluster that resembled a tribal encampment. He essentially built a theme park of Mongolia in the center of downtown Beijing, so he wouldn't get homesick. The most striking echo of the yurt, however, is in the religious architecture. Look up at the skyline. You see the white stupa of Maoying Temple. It was designed by a Nepali architect named Anuj explicitly for Kublai. It is a massive, bulbous white dome topped with a spire. It looks uncannily like a gigantic, whitewashed felt tent solidified into plaster and brick. To the Mongol eye, this was comforting. It was the gers writ large, a holy mountain of white that dominated the low gray roofs of the Chinese commoners. It was a subtle way of saying, the form of the nomad is now the form of the divine. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, inside the main palace complex, Kublai had a structure called the Sera Orju, or Yellow Palace. It wasn't made of stone. It was a colossal pavilion made of woven bamboo and covered in yellow palm fibers and fur. It was technically a building, but structurally, it was a basket. It was detachable and could theoretically be dismantled, though it never was. It was a transitional object, like a toddler's security blanket, but the size of a cathedral. Kublai held his wildest banquets here, surrounded by walls that hissed in the wind, reminding him of the grass. Historians still argue whether the strong north-south axis of Beijing which aligns perfectly with the emperor. As throne is a continuation of the ancient Chinese Son of Heaven geomancy, or if it is a scaling up of the yurt's interior layout. Remember Section 8. The Koimer place of honor is always at the north, facing south towards the door. In Dadu, the emperor sits in the north of the city, facing south towards the main gate. Is Beijing just a really big yurt? The layout matches perfectly. The men's side west became the military districts. The women's side east became the administrative and civilian districts. The city is a fractal expansion of the family home. You walk into the Hall of Great Harmony, or its Yuan dynasty equivalent, the Damming Hall. The scale is crushing. But look at the ceiling. It's a complex coffered design, a series of recessed squares and circles narrowing towards a central point. It draws the eye upward, exactly like the tono wheel. The psychological effect is the same. Centralization of power, connection to the sky. The Mongols didn't invent the dome, but they popularized the centralized sky view aesthetic in East Asian palatial architecture. Even the color palette changed. The Yuan dynasty favored white, the color of holy felt, and blue, the color of tengri. You see these colors seeping into the ceramics and the textiles of the court. The famous blue and white porcelain that we associate with China actually exploded in popularity during the Yuan, partly because the Mongols loved the color combination. It looked like the sky over snow. Your grandmother's fine china is basically a Mongol weather report, but you can feel the tension here. You are walking on stone pavement, your boots clip-clop loudly. There is no silence. The sound-dampening felt is gone. The intimacy of the circle where everyone looks at everyone is replaced by the hierarchy of the long hall, where everyone looks at the emperor and the emperor looks at the door. The community of the yurt is gone, replaced by the theater of the state. Kublai tried to keep the spirit alive. He famously had soil and grass from the steppe brought in to cover the courtyard floors so he could walk on real ground. It's a pathetic, poignant image, the most powerful man on earth, sitting in the most expensive city ever built, importing dirt because he hates his floor. As you leave the palace grounds, you pass the drum tower. The city gates are closing. The rigid curfew is beginning. In the yurt, the door is always open unless it's cold. Here, the doors are locked with iron bars. The transition is complete. The Mongols have built a cage for themselves, gilded and glorious, but a cage nonetheless. They have etched the circle of the yurt into the square of the city, but in doing so, they have frozen the fluid motion that made them invincible. Beijing is a magnificent tomb for the nomadic soul. Step away from the stone dragons of Beijing now. Let's go back to the metaphysical architecture of the empire. You see, in the West, we talk about the House of Windsor or the House of Habsburg. We use house as a metaphor for a dynasty. But for the Mongols, the house and the dynasty were literally the same physical object. The yurt wasn't just where the family slept. It was the diagram of their genetic legitimacy. You are standing before the Altenurg, the Golden Family. This refers to the direct blood descendants of Genghis Khan. In the Mongol worldview, the right to rule was a biological substance contained in the blood of this specific family. And the container for that substance was the orju. Here is a mainstream historical fact. The Mongols practiced a unique form of inheritance called ultimogeniture. In Europe, the eldest son gets the castle primogeniture. In the Mongol world, the eldest sons were sent away to the edges of the empire to conquer their own territory, which explains why the empire expanded so fast. The kids needed their own room, but the youngest son, he stayed home. He was the Achagan, the prince of the fire or guardian of the hearth. He inherited the father's personal yurt, his domestic herds, and the ancestral campsite. Think about the pressure on that kid. You are the youngest sibling, and your job is to literally keep the home fires burning for the ghost of Genghis Khan. You aren't just inheriting furniture, you are inheriting the spiritual core of the empire. The yurt is the crown. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. The Mongols did build a stone pyramid for Genghis Khan when he died in 1227. Instead, they created the 8 white yurts, the nomadsâ. These were portable mausoleums. They didn't contain his body, which was buried in a secret unmarked location, but they contained his soul and his relics. Inside these sacred yurts, which traveled with the army for centuries, were his shirt, his boots, and a piece of camel wool that allegedly caught his last breath. These yurts were guarded by a specific tribe, the Darkad, who were exempt from taxes and military service for 700 years just to guard the tent. The tomb of the unknown soldier is a static monument. The tomb of the great Khan was a camper van that followed the people. You walk towards one of these sacred white yurts. Outside stands the Sold, the spirit banner. It's a spear adorned with horsehair tassels. In peace, the horsehair is white. In war, it is black. The Mongols believed that a man's destiny and charisma Sold lived in this banner. When Genghis died, his soul didn't go to heaven. It went into the banner. So, the banner is the Khan. When the wind blows through the horsehair and it makes that whistling sound, that is the Khan speaking. As long as the banner stands and the yurt is pitched, the golden family is alive. But this yurt-based inheritance system had a fatal flaw. Historians still argue whether the vague succession rules of the steppe were the primary cause of the empire's fragmentation. You see, while the youngest son got the hearth, the great Khan was chosen by a koraltia, massive family meeting election. This created a terrifying conflict between ownership of the house and ownership of the state. Every time a Khan died, the empire paralyzed itself for months or years, while all the princes rode their yurts back to the motherland to argue, bribe, and threaten each other. The fluidity of the yurt allowed them to gather, but it also meant there was no fixed institution to handle the transfer of power. The house was divided against itself because the walls were made of felt. You stand inside the ceremonial yurt of a golden family prince. The hierarchy we saw in Section 8 is now weaponized. Where you sit in this room determines your political future. If the Khan offers you Kumi's fermented milk from his personal cup, you are a governor. If he ignores you, you might be executed tomorrow. The circular space amplifies the tension. In a rectangular throne room, you can hide in the back. In a circle, you are always exposed to the center. The golden family lived in a panopticon of their own making. The concept of the golden tent, â, eventually gave its name to the western part of the empire, the Golden Horde ruling Russia. But notice the shift. They stopped being the Mongol Empire and became the Golden Tent State. The architecture defined the polity. The legitimacy of the rulers in Russia, even centuries later, depended on their ability to trace their lineage back to the owner of that original central yurt. If you were a Gingazudif, you did come from the Golden Tenchu, could be a powerful warlord like Tamerlane, but you could never take the title of Khan. You were just an emir commander. The house was a closed club. You watch the women of the golden family, their role is pivotal. Remember, the women's side of the yurt controls the economy. In the imperial context, the Khatan's queens controlled the treasury and often acted as regents during the chaotic interregnums between Consorgatani Beki. The daughter-in-law of Genghis is perhaps the most powerful woman in world history whom you've never heard of. A Christian woman living in a felt tent, she maneuvered her 4 sons to become 4 separate great Khans, emperors. She masterminded the takeover of the empire from the inside of her gers. She proved that the hand that rocks the cradle, or stirs the arag, rules the world. But as you look at the Sold banner fluttering in the wind, you feel the tragedy of it. The yurt is designed for a single family unit, mother, father, children, grandparents. It works perfectly at that scale. But when you try to stretch that family logic to cover 1 billion people from Korea to Poland, the felt tears, the brothers started fighting. The Joshids in Russia fought the Ilkhanids in Persia. The Shagatids in Central Asia fought the Yuan in China. They were all golden family, all living in identical yurts, all worshipping the same grandfather, yet they slaughtered each other over border disputes. The unbroken lineage, symbolized by the round, seamless wall of the yurt, was broken by the ambition of the men inside it. They forgot the lesson of the khana lattice. The strength comes from the connection of the parts, not the dominance of one slat. As night falls on the camp of the golden family, you see the fires burning in 1,000 hearths. They look like stars reflected on the ground. The Ochigin princes are guarding the fire, but the fire is spreading out of control. The architecture that built the empire is now hosting the civil war that will destroy it. The golden tent is still standing, but the family inside has pulled daggers on each other. The Mongol Empire eventually did what all empires do. It died. The golden family turned on itself, the borders receded, and the great Khans faded into legend. But while the software of the empire, the administration, the yasa, the postal routes crashed, the hardware, the yurt, went viral, it became the most successful open-source architectural project in history. You are now standing not on the Mongolian steppe, but in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan or the plains of Kazakhstan. The people here aren't Mongols, they are Turkic. Yet, look at their homes. They look identical to the ones we left in KAR, AKOR, Or do they? Step closer. This is cultural contagion, and it's fascinating to see how different cultures modded the original design. The first thing you notice is the silhouette. The classic Mongol gear has a conical roofta. Straight unipoles create a sharp straight line from the wall to the crown. It looks like a low pyramid, but here in the West, among the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, the roof is a dome. The poles are bent at the bottom, creating a curved shoulder where the roof meets the wall. This is the Turkic yurt, often called a Kyrgyz uy. It feels much more spacious inside because that bend in the poles gives you more headroom near the walls. You don't have to crouch as much. It's a subtle engineering, tweak steaming and bending the wood, but it changes the entire aesthetic. The Mongol ger looks hunkered down against the wind. The Turkic yurt looks like a bubble floating on the grass. Here is a mainstream historical fact. This distinction, straight poles, Mongol vs bent poles, Turkic, is the primary way anthropologists classify nomadic architecture today. The diffusion was so complete that the yurt became the standard housing from the Great Wall of China all the way to the shores of the Caspian Sea in modern Turkey. The Pax Mongolica might have ended, but the Pax Yurtica is still going strong. But the design didn't just move laterally. It moved vertically into the high culture of the Islamic world. Look at the miniature paintings of the Persian Timurid dynasty, or the Mughals in India. You see stone palaces, yes, but in the gardens you see exquisite, highly decorated tents. These aren't rough felt survival shelters anymore, they are pleasure domes. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. The great conqueror Tamerlane Timur, who tried to restore the Mongol Empire in the 14th century, took yurt luxury to a level that would have made Genghis vomit. He built two-story yurts. Yes, 2 stories. They used massive internal pillars and complex guy rope systems to support a lofted sleeping area. He also covered them not in felt, but in silk and velvet lined with sable fur. These super yurts were so heavy they required hundreds of men to pitch, completely defeating the purpose of mobility. It was architecture as a costume pretending to be a nomad while living like a sultan. Historians still argue whether the yurt is originally a Mongol invention or a Turkic one. The linguistic evidence is messy. The word yurt is actually Turkic, originally meaning territory or a campsite, not the tent itself, while the Mongols call it a ger. Some archaeologists argue that the Turkic tribes of the Altai Mountains developed the lattice wall technology first, and the Mongols adopted it. Others say it was a convergent evolution. It's the Apple versus Android debate of the medieval steppe. Who really invented the smartphone? Who really invented the collapsible home? As you travel further west, you see the yurt hitting a hard climate wall. In the Middle East, the Bedouin used the black tent woven from goat hair, stretched over poles, open to the breeze. Why didn't the yurt take over the desert? Because felt is too good at its job. It traps heat. In the scorching Arabian sun, a felt yurt is a slow cooker. The diffusion stopped exactly where the humidity and heat made the wool rot and the interior unbearable. The architecture is strictly geofenced by the thermodynamics of sheep hair. But look at Russia. The Golden Horde ruled there for centuries, even after the Russians kicked the Mongols out. The word kibitka, the yurt cart, remained in the Russian language to describe any covered wagon or carriage. The visual language of the onion dome on Russian Orthodox churches. Does that bulbous shape remind you of anything? Some architectural historians suggest a link between the silhouette of the Tatar yurts and the development of the onion dome, a way of claiming the skyline with a familiar sacred shape. The yurt also influenced military logistics in Europe. The bell tent used by Western armies for centuries is essentially a simplified, structureless cousin of the central pole tent, but the idea of a modular, round, squad-based shelter owes a debt to the steppe. As you watch a Kyrgyz family erecting their bentwood home using the same trellis pattern, but decorating it with bright felt sherduk rugs that look like neon puzzles, you realize the resilience of the design. Empires rise and fall, religions change, languages shift, but the physics of the lattice wall and the tension ring remain. The yurt didn't just help the Mongols conquer the world. It convinced the world that this was the best way to live in the wild. It is a virus of pure utility. Fast forward 800 years, you are no longer on the windswept steppe of the 13th century. You are scrolling through Airbnb, looking for a weekend getaway in Big Sur, California, or maybe the Swiss Alps. And there it is. Under the category Unique Stays, you see a familiar shape, a white, circular dome with a lattice wall and a crown wheel. It costs $400 a night, features a memory foam mattress, Wi-Fi, and a skylight. Welcome to the era of the modern yurt revival. The architecture of the apocalypse has become the architecture of the avocado toast generation. But before you roll your eyes at the glamping phenomenon, look closer. This isn't just hipster aestheticism. The return of the yurt represents a serious shift in modern architectural thinking. We are finally realizing that the Mongols were right about geometry. In a world facing climate change, housing crises, and natural disasters, the square box, the symbol of sedentary permanence, is failing us. The circle is making a comeback. You stand in front of a modern Pacific yurt. It looks like its ancestor, but the materials have evolved. The heavy felt is gone, replaced by architectural-grade vinyl and reflective foil insulation developed by NASA. The willow lattice is now Klendrid, Douglas fir, or even aircraft-grade aluminum. But the physics? The physics are exactly the same. The tension band still holds the roof. The compression ring still holds the sky. Here is a mainstream historical fact. The modern yurt industry in the West exploded in the 1960s and 70s. Driven by the counterculture movement, pioneers like Bill Copperthwaite believed that the yurt was the solution to the tyranny of the square. He saw the corner as a waste of space and material. Mathematically, a circle encloses the maximum amount of internal area for the minimum amount of perimeter wall. This means a yurt uses significantly fewer building materials to create the same square footage as a rectangular cabin. It is inherently efficient. It is the tiny home before tiny homes were cool. You walk inside this modern adaptation. It feels familiar, but different. There are windows, actual glass windows, set into the lattice. The tono is now an acrylic dome that can be cranked open for ventilation. But the feeling of the space is identical. The acoustic dampening, the way the air circulates, the psychological centering of the round remits, all there. You feel a sudden drop in anxiety. There is something about a room without corners that stops the mind from feeling trapped. But the revival isn't just about luxury camping. It's about survival. You are now standing in a disaster zone, maybe post-earthquake, Turkey, or a refugee camp. You see rows of silvery angular shelters. These are hexyurts, invented by Vinay Gupta. These aren't traditional bentwood yurts, but they apply the same logic of modularity and tension. They are made from standard 4x8 sheets of industrial insulation board taped together. They can be mass-produced for cheap, flat-packed, and deployed by unskilled labor in minutes. They are the spiritual successors to the Mongol Gararapa deployment shelter system for a displaced population. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. The Burning Man Festival in the Nevada desert is essentially the largest temporary yurt city on Earth since the time of Genghis Khan. Every year, thousands of modern nomads build a circular city that exists for a week and then vanishes, leaving no trace, a concept identical to the Mongol reverence for the beer. The hexyurt became famous there, not as art, but because it was the only thing that didn't blow away in the 70 miles per hour dust storms. The physics of the steppe apply perfectly to the Black Rock Desert. The Mongols solved the wind problem in 1000 BC, and modern burners just rediscovered it. Historians and architects still argue whether the modern permanent yurt misses the entire point of the design. You see, in the West, we tend to build yurts on concrete platforms and hook them up to the sewage grid. We make them immovable. Critics argue that a yurt that doesn't move is just a roundhouse with bad insulation. The genius of the Mongol system was the portability. By fixing it in place, are we stripping the soul out of the machine? Are we just wearing the costume of the nomad without understanding the philosophy of the movement? You probably wouldn't survive the zoning meeting to get one of these built, though. Modern building codes are obsessed with squares. They hate circles. Where is the foundation? Where are the load-bearing studs? How do you frame a door in a moving wall? The yurt challenges the bureaucratic state just as much today as the Mongol hordes did in the 13th century. It represents a way of living that doesn't fit in the box, literally. But look at the eco-architecture angle. A yurt sits on the land, not in it. It requires no deep excavation. When you remove a yurt, the grass springs back in a year. Compare that to a concrete foundation that scars the earth for centuries. As we look for ways to live more lightly on the planet, the Mongol strategy of touching the earth lightly is becoming the gold standard. You see eco-villages springing up in Oregon and France, where entire communities live in yurts. They share a central lodge yurt, creating a compound that looks suspiciously like a Mongol extended family camp. They are rediscovering the social benefits of the circle. In a square room, you tend to gravitate to the edges, to the walls. In a round room, you gravitate to the center. It forces connection. It forces eye contact. Even the wind resistance is finding new relevance. As climate change creates more extreme weather events, hurricanes, typhoons, traditional square roofs are being ripped off. But the conical roof of the yurt, the wind flows around it. It is aerodynamic. We are seeing hurricane-proof round homes being built in Florida that are essentially concrete yurts. The engineering of the steppe is saving lives in the tropics. So, as you lie back on the memory foam mattress in your Airbnb yurt, looking up at the stars through the acrylic dome, realize that you are participating in a 3,000-year-old architectural lineage. You are sheltered by a design that conquered the world not because it was pretty, but because it worked. The materials have changed: nylon instead of felt, wire instead of horsehair, but the promise is the same. Shelter that is strong, simple, and harmonious with the chaotic world outside. The Mongols didn't just build an empire, they built the ultimate prototype for the future of housing. Let's pivot the camera for a moment. Most documentaries about the Mongols focus on the bearded guys on horses shooting arrows. You know the type, grimacing, waving a sword, shouting about conquering the world. But if you look at the actual convoy moving across the steppe, you notice something that shatters the Hollywood stereotype. The drivers of those massive ox carts, they aren't men. The people erecting the city every night. Not men. The engineers who actually understand how the yurt stays upright in a blizzard. They are all women. You are watching the driver's seat of the Mongol Empire. While the men are off on the perimeter hunting, scouting, or fighting, the women are literally driving the civilization forward. In a very real sense, the Mongol man was a guest in his own house. The yurt belonged to the woman. She built it, she packed it, she drove it, and she decided where it would be pitched. You probably wouldn't survive a day under the supervision of a Mongol matriarch. If you think your project manager is tough, try explaining to a grandmother why you dropped a 100-pound roll of felt into a puddle of mud. The competence required to manage a mobile household of this complexity is staggering. These women weren't just keeping house, they were logistics officers commanding a mobile industrial unit. Here is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval travelers from Europe, like the Franciscan friar John of Plano Carpini, were baffled by the gender roles they saw. In Europe, women were legally property, confined to the home, and excluded from men's work. On the steppe, Carpini observed women driving wagons, repairing wheels, butchering animals, sewing leather boots, and even shooting bows. He noted that Mongol women were chaste but incredibly manly in their capabilities. They didn't need protection. They needed people to get out of their way so they could park the cart. But they didn't look like laborers. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. The most iconic fashion statement of the Mongol Empire was the silk robe. It was the bakta, or bak. This was a towering cylindrical headdress made of birch bark and covered in expensive silk, or felt, often topped with peacock feathers. Some of these hats were over 3 feet 1 meter tall. Imagine driving a cart across rough terrain while balancing a yardstick on your head. It was a supreme display of balance and status. But here's the kicker. The bakta was so tall that a noble woman literally could not walk through the door of her yurt forwards. She had to back in, ducking her head, to avoid snapping the feathers off on the doorframe. It was a daily, ritualized entrance that screamed, "I am too magnificent for this architecture." You watch a woman in a bakta directing the setup of the camp. She isn't shouting, she's using hand signals. The children and servants move instantly. She inspects the tension of the ropes, she checks the angle of the smoke hole. She is the chief engineer, If the ger collapses in the night, it's her fault. If the fire goes out, it's her fault. But conversely, the warmth and safety of the family are entirely her creation. The interior of the yurt reflects this power. As we discussed, the women's side, the east, held the food and the churns. In a calorious, scarce environment, controlling the food supply is controlling the family. A Mongol husband couldn't just grab a snack, he had to be served. The woman held the keys to the larder. Furthermore, the production of felt, the critical material for the walls, was exclusively women's work. They made the walls, they owned the walls. Historians still argue whether this economic centrality translated into true political matriarchy or if it was just a golden cage. Did the women have real power, or were they just trusted with the heavy lifting, while the men made the real decisions? The career of Sorghutani Beki, the mother of Kublai Khan, suggests the former. She didn't just raise emperors, she managed the appanage territory of northern China so effectively that the local peasants preferred her rule to that of the male generals. She used the administration of her massive household as a training ground for imperial administration. The home economics of the yurt scaled up perfectly to the economics of the state. You also have to consider the defense of the home. When the main army was away on campaign, which could be for years, the women were left alone on the steppe to manage the herds and defend the camp. There are numerous accounts of women taking up bows to drive off raiders or wolves. They weren't damsels in distress. They were the home guard. The yurt was a fortress, and the woman was the castellan. There is a softness here too. You watch a mother tying a felt charm to the wall lattice near the baby's cradle. The yurt is a dangerous place for a toddler open fire. Heavy pots, drafty floors. The women created a safe zone within the hard environment. They invented the BS swaddling bands that allowed them to strap babies to boards, which could be hung from the lattice wall or strapped to a saddle. A Mongol baby spent its first year essentially as a piece of luggage, secure and warm, watching the world bounce by from the back of a horse. The division of labor extended to the materials themselves. Men worked with hard materials, wood, iron, bone. Women worked with soft materials, wool, leather, milk, but the genius of the yurt is that the soft materials hold the hard materials together. The wood frame men would fall apart without the ropes, and felt women. It is a structural metaphor for their society. The rigid skeleton of the army required the binding tension of the domestic sphere to function. As night falls, you see the women gathering by the carts, smoking pipes and laughing. They are exhausted, covered in dust and sheep grease, but there is a swagger to them. They know they are the backbone of the operation. Without them, the great Khan is just a homeless guy on a horse. They are the unsung architects of the largest contiguous land empire in history. And they did it all while wearing 3-foot hats. Step inside the yurt one last time, but don't look at the lattice or the felt. Close your eyes and just feel the space. You are standing in a perfect circle. For us, raised in a world of rectangle square rooms, rectangular desks, boxy apartments, the psychological impact of this shape is hard to grasp. But architecture isn't just shelter, it's a mold for the human mind, and the Mongol mind was molded by a world without corners. If you've ever tried to have a private argument in a studio apartment, you know the struggle. Now imagine that apartment is round, and your grandmother, your 3 kids, and a baby goat are all watching you. There is nowhere to hide. You can't storm off into the bedroom. There is no bedroom. You can't go sulk in the corner. There are no corners. This architectural reality forced a profound psychological adaptation. Radical conflict resolution. You either solve the problem immediately, or you repress it so deep it becomes an ulcer. There is no spatial cooling off period. This brings us to the psychology of the circle. In a square room, the energy and the dust bunnies gets trapped in the corners. The corners are dead space, but in a circle, energy flows, it cycles. If you sit in a circle with a group of people, the hierarchy softens. King Arthur had his round table to imply equality among knights, but the Mongols lived in a round house every single day. Everyone faces the center. Everyone faces the fire. Everyone faces each other. It creates a high-context society where body language, glances, and subtle shifts in posture communicate volumes because you are always on display. You probably wouldn't survive the social pressure of the yurt. In the West, we equate privacy with freedom. To the Mongol, privacy was suspicion. If you wanted to be alone, it meant you were plotting something or you were sick. The yurt created a hive mind mentality. The I is suppressed in favor of the we. When the walls are curved, the individual focus is constantly deflected back towards the group. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The circle is the most efficient shape in nature for containment. Think of a water drop or a cell, but it is also the most defensive shape. In a square fortress, the corners are weak points, blind spots where a defender can't see. In a circle, the line of sight is continuous. This architectural defensiveness bled into the Mongol worldview. They perceived the world as a horizontal ring of threats. Their foreign policy was essentially expand the circle until there is nothing left outside to hurt us. But let's talk about the spiritual hygiene of the circle. This offers a quirky or fringe tidbit in many shamanic and later folk traditions across Eurasia. It was believed that evil spirits, or chotgor, liked to hide in corners. Corners are where shadows gather. Corners are where the flow of chi or spiritual energy gets stuck and turns stagnant. By living in a round house, the Mongols effectively built a spirit-proof dwelling. There were no dark nooks for a demon to lurk in. The air, the smoke, and the spirits circulated freely. It was a feng shui dream scenario, a house that naturally cleansed itself of bad vibes simply by being round. Historians and psychologists still argue whether this lack of physical boundaries stunted the development of individualism in the Western sense, or if it created a superior form of collective resilience. Did the Mongols fail to develop a Renaissance-style culture of individual artistic genius because they literally had no room of one's own? Or did they conquer the world precisely because they didn't suffer from the modern neurosis of separation? The yurt suggests that humans are designed to sleep in a pile, not in separate boxes. Now look up the tono. We've talked about it as a chimney, but psychologically, it is an anchor. In a modern house, the ceiling is a barrier. It shuts out the sky. In a yurt, the most important part of the roof is the hole. This orients the Mongol mind vertically, no matter where they are on the horizontal plane, which changes every day. Their vertical connection to Tengri, the sky god, is permanent. You are always sleeping under the eye of God. This creates a sense of cosmic insignificance and cosmic connection simultaneously. You are small, but you are part of the infinite. This vertical orientation might explain their terrifying lack of attachment to the land itself. This is the psychology of the non-place. To a farmer, the land is everything. This is my field. My father plowed this field. To a Mongol, the land is just a floorboard. You don't own the floor, you just stand on it. The yurt teaches you that home is a construct you carry with you, not a place you visit. Imagine the freedom of that. If your house burns down in a modern city, your life is over. You lose your investment, your location, your status. If a yurt burns down, which happened often, you just build another one. The materials, wood and wool, are renewable. The blueprint is in your head. The Mongol psychology is antifragile. They do unfear loss in the same way because their entire material culture is designed to be temporary. They are the ultimate minimalists, not by choice, but by architectural necessity. You can't be a hoarder if you have to move your house every 2 weeks. The cart limits your greed. But there is a dark side to the circle. It can be a cage. The panopticon effect, where you are always being watched and forces rigid conformity. If you break a taboo, like stepping on the threshold, everyone sees it. There is no backstage area in a yurt. This created a society of intense self-regulation. You don't need a police force when your mother-in-law is staring at you from across the fire pit 24 hours a day. The social control is baked into the floor plan. As you sit there, watching the smoke curl up through the tono in a perfect spiral, you realize that the circle is a loop. It represents the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of life and death, the cycle of the sun. The Mongol didn't view time as a straight line progressing from barbarism to civilization. They viewed it as a wheel. You move, you graze, you kill, you eat, you die, and the grass grows back. The yurt is the physical manifestation of that philosophy. In our modern world, we are obsessed with progress, with moving forward, with climbing the ladder. Our skyscrapers are arrows pointing up. The yurt is a dot. It doesn't point anywhere, it just is. It centers you in the present moment. You can't worry about the future when the fire needs fuel now. You can't worry about the past when you left the campsite yesterday. So, the next time you feel trapped in your cubicle or lonely in your apartment, remember the yurt. It suggests that human beings were meant to live in circles, huddled around a fire, watching each other's backs, with a direct line of sight to the stars. It's a psychology of exposure, of vulnerability, and of absolute, terrifying connection. You might hate the lack of privacy, but you'd never be lonely. And in the vast, empty silence of the steppe, loneliness is the only thing that can truly kill you. So here we are, at the end of the line. We've dismantled the walls, packed the carts, grazed the herds, and built a capital city only to abandon it for a garden tent. We've looked at the nuts and bolts literally, the wood and wool of the most terrifyingly efficient empire humanity has ever seen. And now, as the dust settles on the 13th century, we have to ask the big question: what did it all mean? Was the yurt just a tent, or was it the secret weapon that unlocked the globe? You stand in the ruins of Karakoram today, there isn't much left. A few stone turtles, some crumbled walls, endless wind. If you look for the monuments of the Mongol Empire, you won't find pyramids or colosseums. You won't find a Parthenon. By the standards of traditional history, the Mongols left nothing behind. But look past the ruins. Look a few hundred yards away into the green valley. What do you see? You see a white felt yurt, smoke curling from its tomb. No, it is identical to the one Genghis Khan was born in. It is identical to the one that carried the Golden Horde to Russia. The stone city died. The empire collapsed. But the gers survived. The temporary structure outlasted the permanent one. This is the ultimate irony of the Mongol story. The architecture designed to vanish is the only thing that remained. Here is a mainstream historical fact. The Pax Mongolica, that century of relative peace where trade flowed from Beijing to Venice, was only possible because the yurt acted as the standardized service station of the Silk Road. The Mongols established the Yam postal system, with relay stations every 20 to 30 miles. These stations weren't expensive stone-ins. They were clusters of yurts. Because they were cheap, modular, and easy to staff, the Mongols could blanket the continent with infrastructure in a few years. You could buy a bolt of silk in China and sell it in Italy because there was a chain of felt safety deposit boxes stretching across the entire dangerous middle bit. The yurt didn't just house the Mongols, it housed the first era of globalization. But this connectivity had a dark side, a passenger that hitched a ride in the felt. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. Many epidemiologists believe that the Black Death, the bubonic plague that wiped out half of Europe, didn't just travel on rats. It traveled in the material culture of the Mongols. The plague bacterium is endemic to the marmots of the steppe. The Mongols hunted marmots for their fur and meat. When the infected fleas jumped from the marmots, where did they go? Into the warm, fibrous layers of the felt rugs and wall coverings stored in the carts. The yurt carts became mobile biological incubators, insulating the disease and transporting it thousands of miles west, keeping the fleas alive through winters that should have killed them. The architecture that built the empire also delivered the weapon that destroyed the medieval world. You probably wouldn't survive the irony of sneezing while admiring a nice imported carpet. Historians still argue whether the Mongol Empire fell in the traditional sense or if it simply dissolved back into the landscape. When Rome fell, it was a catastrophe because the Romans had forgotten how to live without aqueducts and marble floors. But when the Yuan dynasty collapsed in China, the Mongols just packed up their yurts and went back north. They didn't lose their technology, they just rebooted the system. Some scholars argue that the collapse was actually a successful strategic withdrawal enabled by their architecture. If your house has wheels, you can never truly be conquered. You can only be chased. The legacy of the yurt goes beyond survival, though. It challenged the very definition of civilization. For millennia, humans believed that to be civilized meant to settle down, to build walls, to farm. The Mongols proved you could have a sophisticated law code, a global economy, a complex religion, and a massive military without ever laying a single brick. They proved that civilization is software, not hardware. It's about the network of people, not the pile of rocks. You look at that modern yurt in the valley again. It represents a freedom we have lost. We are owned by our mortgages, anchored by our utilities, trapped by our geography. The Mongol on his ox cart was arguably the freest human being to ever walk the earth. He owed nothing to the ground beneath his feet. If the king was a tyrant, he moved. If the weather was bad, he moved. If he just got bored, he moved. The yurt was the physical manifestation of the word no. It was the power to walk away from a bad deal. As you watch the sun set over the steppe one last time, painting the white felt domes in shades of pink and gold, you realize that Genghis Khan didn't conquer the world with a sword. He conquered it with a lattice wall and a circle of rope. He realized that while stone walls can be smashed, a willow branch just bends. He built an empire that flowed like water, adapting to every container it poured into, yet remaining distinct. The yurt is a reminder that strength isn't about rigidity, it's about resilience. It's about being able to collapse when the pressure is too high and spring back up when the storm passes. In a world that feels increasingly fragile, where our rigid systems are cracking under the strain of change, perhaps we should look back at the collapsible city. Maybe the future doesn't belong to the skyscraper. Maybe it belongs to the tent. So, the next time you see a circola coin, a wheel, the moon, remember the felt walls. Remember the smell of the dung fire and the sound of the wind in the grass. Remember the empire that rolled across the world and left no trace but a flattened circle in the grass, a ghost print of a home that was everywhere and nowhere all at once. 300-word wind down, the fire in the hearth has burned down to a bed of glowing orange coals. The frantic energy of the empire, the thundering hooves, the screeching axles, the shouting of the orgeoist faded into the vast, absorbing silence of the night. The wind is still blowing outside, buffeting the felt walls, but inside, the air is still. It is a heavy, comfortable stillness. You are safe here in the circle. The lattice walls, bound tight with horsehair, hold the world at bay. The white felt, pressed by 1,000 hands, wraps you in a warmth that goes deeper than skin. It is the warmth of history, of 1,000,000 nights, just like this one, played out over 3,000 years of survival. Watch the smoke curl lazily up towards the tono. Through that open eye, you can see the same stars that guided the caravans, the same stars that Genghis watched as a boy, the same stars that look down on your roof tonight. They are the only map that never changes. Let your breathing slow down to match the rhythm of the fire. In, out, the tension of the datha, need to build, to move, to conquer melts away. There is nowhere to go right now. The cart is parked. The oxen are sleeping. The work is done. You don't need to be a warrior tonight. You don't need to defend a fortress or manage a supply chain. You just need to rest. The earth is beneath you, solid and patient. The sky is above you, endless and open. And you are here, suspended in the center, held in the embrace of the circle. Let the darkness wash over you, soft and protective. The story is over, but the circle remains unbroken. Sleep well, traveler. The horizon will still be there tomorrow.